Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're going to reconvene. We have had, regrettably, we've had a dropout. Dr. Roginski, coming from Ottawa, couldn't get a flight down, so we've shuffled the panels slightly. And you'll see that now we have at the panel Josh Kerbel, who was originally on panel 4. Also, Claire Lockhart, although I heard a rumor that she was here today, is not up to speaking due to an illness. Fortunately, on that count, former Assistant Secretary Rick Barton agreed to step in and speak about his experience at the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the State Department. So this panel is elegantly named Entropic Enablers. The reason for that name is it comes from a book that was recently published by Dr. Randy Schweller, who couldn't come today. The book has the interesting title of Maxwell's Apple and the Golden Hammer, or something like that. It's a slightly surprising title, but his argument is that the level of entropy in the world today has increased to such a point that there is very little available useful energy to do anything constructive, such as strategy or planning. And that it's a systemic and irreversible condition leading to disorder. What enables that to take place? One of the things that I think that came up from the last panel is just a question was asked, so what? Is this anything new? 10 years ago, Dr. Moises Naim, who is a mentor of mine, argued that yes, we've had smuggling and we've had illicit networks and we've had all of this activity since time immemorial. It goes back, you can find it in biblical literature. But what's truly different, what makes it so what makes it distinctive is the scale, the magnitude and the velocity. And our first panelist is going to talk a little bit about that, but it's just, if you think in terms of perspective, the so-called illicit economy now represents, according to the IMF, 5% of global product. 5% of global product, that's trillions of dollars. And what people can do with that kind of capital is unprecedented. So without further comment from me, I'm going to invite Mr. James Cockayne from the United Nations to start this panel off.
Thanks very much, Mike. In 1999, former CIA Director Jim Woolsey appeared before the House Committee on Banking, and he had a little story to tell. He explained, if you should chance to strike up a conversation with an articulate English-speaking Russian in, say, the restaurant of one of the luxury hotels along the shores of Lake Geneva, and he's wearing a $3,000 suit and a pair of Gucci loafers, and he tells you that he's an executive of a trading company and he's interested in a joint venture with you, then there are 4 possibilities. 1, he may be exactly what he says he is. 2, he may be a Russian intelligence officer working under commercial cover. 3, he may be a part of a Russian organized crime syndicate. But the really interesting possibility, he said, is the 4th one, that he is all 3 of those things, and that none of those 3 institutions has any problem with that arrangement whatsoever. We've heard a lot this morning about this kind of convergence and the role that different institutions have in making it happen. But the question that was posed by Dr. Corker is, so what? Well, how can states plan and act strategically if we can't tell these adversaries apart? If we can't tell what strategic outlook and approach governs their conduct? If we can't tell if we're dealing with a Russian state official, a businessman, an organized criminal, or a Yankees fan, to pick up on Matt Levitt's point. Isn't there a danger, this is the point made by such diverse and lucid commentators as Phil Williams, Susan Strange, and Martin van Clevold, isn't there a danger that the whole system begins to break down if the basis of legitimacy and reciprocity, the trust that underlies the interstate system, isn't there a danger that that all begins to break down? The title of this conference, A World Without Order, and this particular panel, Entropic Enablers, would seem to suggest that's the case. But in the short time I have available today, I want to present a slightly different proposition and talk about how that proposition might help us begin to see order where we might otherwise see disorder, how we can begin to distinguish between the Russian-clad, the Gucci-clad businessman on the shores of Lake Geneva, understand what is driving his strategy. This is an argument that I present in a book that's forthcoming slightly later in the year, entitled Hidden Power: Mafia States and the Strategic Logic of Organised Crime. And the basic proposition is simply this, that what we see at present is not a world without order, but a world in which different groups are seeking to impose their own kind of order, sometimes working within and sometimes working beyond the state system, sometimes opposing statehood outright and sometimes seeking to co-opt it for their own purposes. But it is fundamentally a global strategic competition, a competition to govern. So what I want to do with my time is three simple things. First, explain why I think organised crime wields governmental power and has governmental goals. Secondly, talk about the different positioning strategies that we see organised criminal groups adopting in relation to the state and to other governmental rivals. And third, explain what this has to do with entropic enablers. So let me explain first why I think organised crime wields governmental power. Well, criminologists have long recognised this point, that in illicit markets in particular, and in some cases in marginalised communities, some criminal groups do wield the same kinds of powers that states do. They set norms, they resolve disputes, and they allocate resources. But strategic theory, political science, and security studies has tended to exclude the possibility that organised crime is an actor in the spheres that they're interested in, because they've said that they're interested in profit, not in what we classically think of as political power. In some ways, that's a slightly odd presumption or assumption when you think about it, because we don't make that assumption for legitimate business. We have a whole theory around regulatory capture, or what in this country is sometimes called lobbying, or, if you believe the Supreme Court, free speech. Why wouldn't illegitimate business do exactly the same thing? And why would it stop at lobbying? Why wouldn't it buy a whole political party, or even, frankly, a whole government? What's to stop it? Well, my answer in the book, after looking at numerous historical case studies, is not much. In the book, I look in depth at cases over more than a century involving Italian, American, and Cuban organised crime, developing governmental power strategically at the local level, national level, and then using it at the international level. This isn't about formal government. Criminal strategy involves eschewing the responsibilities of political role. It's about a hidden governmental power. My archival research has turned up a whole range of cases involving this kind of activity. Criminal groups secretly working with the US Navy and the CIA to plan and execute both domestic and foreign intelligence, enforcement, and military operations, including policing New York's docks and unions during World War II, catching Nazi saboteurs that had landed on Long Island, and phalangist plotters in Harlem, helping plan and execute the invasion of Sicily, and extensive collaboration in attempts to kill Fidel Castro, perhaps one of the better known and more lurid examples. But it also looks at criminal groups mounting full-scale military interventions into foreign countries on their own, including in Cuba and Haiti. And of course, we've seen more recent examples of this kind of thing with the Zetas in Guatemala. It looks also at criminal groups seeking to effect regime change, including through using a PR outfit here in Washington to stand up not one but two separate Cuban governments in exile in the 1960s, and later helping to end white rule in the Bahamas in order to further their own criminal strategy. In other cases I look at, criminal groups have worked with senior officials in the Allied military government in Italy to install criminal actors in political office and then to support a separatist insurgency in Sicily, intended to maximise their own political bargaining power in the arrangement of Italy's post-war political settlement. We also see criminal groups threatening to create entirely new states, changing the whole structure of the interstate system in order to strengthen their own bargaining position. And finally, criminal groups working with political elites, or what Niels Gilman might have called plutocratic insurgents, to corrupt and skew municipal politics, post-conflict transitions, and national development processes. So what these all point to is that even as organised crime formally avoids political rule, it seeks to develop hidden governmental power and hidden political power, including at the international level. Second, the cases point to a series of different ideal type strategies that we can see these criminal groups taking in how they position themselves in what we might call the market for government. Three of these involve different types of accommodation, and they're all things that we've been touching on this morning. Some intermediate or broker between the state and markets or communities that it has trouble governing. We call these groups mafias traditionally, and that kind of segmentation of the market for government, it's a jurisdictional segmentation. It's not based on territory, it's based on different types of markets. We see this, we regularly describe this as the upper world and the underworld. But other actors that we heard about this morning, they segment the market for government with the state on quite a different basis, what I would call a territorial basis. In that case, armed groups maximise their criminal rents not through brokering, but through local autonomy, as we heard about this morning, without renouncing the state's formal rule. And we've tended historically to call these kinds of actors warlords when they're rural, or dons or bosses or gang leaders when they're more urban. This, I would argue, is what we might be seeing on with the discussion Doug Farah led this morning about the valleys in Honduras that are coming under the autonomous rule of criminal actors. And third, there's a third positioning strategy that emerges around accommodation, which is what I would call a joint venture. It's quite similar to what Doug Farah has called criminalised states. In this case, there is no segmentation of the market. Instead, political and criminal actors combine their capabilities to enlarge the market. And in the book, I look at several examples of this, going back 150 years. Boss Tweed's system of government in New York, the American mob's cooperation with Batista in Cuba, and also the Sicilian mafia's collaboration with the Christian Democrats to rule Palermo in the post-war transition. Briefly, the book also looks at several other strategies that emerge not when these kinds of powers cooperate and accommodate each other, but when they compete. Foreign state sponsorship against local states, the use of terrorism as a criminal strategy in itself to enlarge the criminal group's power, as we heard about from Dr. Makarenko this morning, the Sicilian Mafia did in the late 80s and early 1990s. And perhaps most fascinatingly, what I call the criminal blue ocean strategy, picking up on a term developed by Michael Porter in management theory. This involves criminal groups not competing in the bloody red ocean of a market in which they have many competitors, including the government, but creating an entirely new market, finding a new market, a blue ocean, which is not running red with blood. And in the market for government, what we're talking about there is actually creating new political entities or changing the constitution of existing ones in ways that legitimise the criminal behaviour and allow them to enlarge criminal rents. And we see this in several cases, the most obvious one being the threatened Sicilian separatism. The point that I'm trying to make here is that all of these are strategies. They're not identities. They can shift and change as armed groups respond strategically, not only to what's going on in the external environment and the criminal rents that they can capture, but also to competition within the group itself, as different arms of the group, some with more political goals, some with more criminal goals, come to power. What that leads us to is a conclusion that what looks like disorder may in fact, despite involving disruption to the existing order, follow some other novel strategic logic that we're having trouble discerning ourselves. So in the book I apply some of these ideas to more current cases such as Mexico and the Sahel. And that point, helps to highlight the importance of what this panel calls entropic enablers, things that have changed since the historical cases of the American mob or the Sicilian mafia. And there are three I want to just single out in the few minutes remaining. Those three are transport, finance, and communications. First, the globalization of transport. It's almost trite at this point to observe that globalized air and naval transport have facilitated organized crime. But it's also internationalized conflict. And what's important to recognize there is that in some ways these two phenomena are converging. Both involve a massive reduction of the barriers to entry in the competition to govern. What I mean by that is that small armed groups that used to garner their power simply from local protection rackets can now plug into transnationalized supply chains, transnationalized arms markets, and sustain themselves and grow in ways that previously they could not. This is as true of the drug trafficking Maras as it is of Mokhtar Belmokhtar, the AQIM terrorist who is also known as Mr. Marlborough because of his key role in Sahelian cigarette trafficking. Second, the globalization of finance. Did somebody say HSBC? I think what the HSBC story misses, though, is the connection between illicit finance and politics. The globalization of banking has reduced the barriers to entry into politics for criminal actors worldwide. This has really particularly important implications in post-conflict transitions, because a rush to elections in those circumstances rewards those political actors that can get a hold of cash. And who can supply that cash in those contexts? It's usually either the armed groups that have earned nefarious proceeds of crime through the conflict itself, or foreign criminal financiers. And this is particularly why we see drug trafficking organisations and narco dollars having such a pernicious effect on governance, not just in Latin America, but also now, for example, in West Africa. The link between political financing and illicit financing is very old, as the book shows. It goes back probably as far as democracy and perhaps even beyond. But the globalization of finance has given capital a power in the system that outstrips the power of any individual nation state. And the current structure allows local politicians to tap into that illicit financing system in ways that are potentially quite dangerous, particularly in post-conflict contexts. Finally, the globalization of communications. Effective strategic communication is a central part of developing governmental power in any context. Because when the state is absent, the key resource becomes trust. To keep the organisation together, when you don't have the state to enforce decisions, you need trust. So frequently organised crime is built on the back of existing kinship networks. But what we see in cases like Mexico and the Sahel is that groups that started out as what we have thought of as organised crime are now tapping into a whole range of other sources of trust to build their own organisation, their own strategy and identity. In Mexico, for example, we've moved from narco cartels to narco cults, as criminal groups have moved from tapping into the trusts and norms borrowed from kinship networks to military structures, the Zetas, who were built off the back of a military structure, religion, La Familia Michoacana, and even medieval monastic militias, the Knights Templar. In the Sahel, we see a complex and shifting network, a kaleidoscope, to use another phrase from this morning, of militants drawing on a range of discourses, from Tuareg separatism to religious faith and even international jihadism, even as many of them remain deeply involved in organised crime. My point here is that these same individual actors may pop up at different times, adopting these different identities and using these different strategies depending on how they understand their strategic circumstances. Simply relying on one-size-fits-all labels for them may actually be counterproductive to our own strategic analysis and planning. So, for example, in the Sahel, Iyad Aghali has shifted between multiple roles. He started out as a Tuareg separatist in the late 1980s. Then he became a state-sponsored broker in the hostage market in northern Mali in the early 2000s. He was then sent as a Malian diplomat to Saudi Arabia, where his encounter with extreme Islamism changed his strategic outlook, and he now leads Ansar Dine, an Islamist extremist group that has control of parts of northern Mali. So what looks highly entropic, irrational, and a-strategic may actually be quite strategic. There may be order there, it may just be that there is a competition between different versions of the preferable order that is creating this violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm the Chief of Analytic Tradecraft at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I haven't been there that long, coming up on 3 years. Spent the prior 18 years moving around the IC. I worked at CIA for a number of years, at the DNI, at the Office of Naval Intelligence, on the naval staff, at the National Intelligence University, on the National Intelligence Council. So I've moved around a little bit, and I think that sort of suggests two things. My colleagues joke that it suggests two things. One, that I have somewhat of an IC perspective on things, and the other thing is that I have a difficult time keeping a job. And there is some truth to that. I would simply say that I've never been fired from one of the intelligence agencies, but they have tired of me. And they tire because what I'm going to talk about is somewhat controversial. And it's not controversial in theory, but it gets controversial in implementation, because I think you'll see that in terms of implementation, it would require an awful lot of change. And like most big bureaucracies, there's a sort of an ingrained resistance to that kind of change. I have to, at this point, sort of give the obligatory disclaimer that everything I say here today is my opinion alone, and it's not necessarily the opinion of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or any element thereof. You can see how used I am to saying that. Okay, so if that is a jumping-in point, I want to start with sort of two I think mutually supporting propositions. Number one is that in order to deal effectively with this world that we heard described here today, we really need an effective intelligence community. The second proposition, as I would argue, is that the intelligence community is really not that different from the U.S. government writ large. And a lot of the problems and challenges that face the intelligence community indeed face the government itself faces writ large. So even if you discount the proposition that the intelligence community is key to the U.S. government dealing with this world, I think that the things I'm going to say here today should still be relevant in the sense that it says an awful lot about the U.S. government as a whole. And that's the story that I'm going to tell to you. I'm going to start by jumping back to the 1940s, to the establishment of our current national security apparatus, the National Security Act of 1947, the addendum in 49, the creation of the CIA, the creation of the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, and so forth. And it was a world, it was sort of a beginning point in many ways for the United States. And it was a system that we engineered here that was actually very well configured to the world that we were confronting. We were facing a problem in the Soviet Union that was something that you heard earlier that we were used to looking at in terms of that it was a state. It was discrete in that its edges were pretty clear, and indeed the United States was instrumental in helping maintain those edges. We had a pretty clear sense worldwide of what American policy was, right? If nothing else, you always knew that it mostly derived from the whole notion of containment. So there was a simplicity in that. There was an assumption that if you wanted to know what was going on inside the Soviet Union, you needed secrets. So right off the bat, the intelligence community had something that nobody else had. If the policymaker wanted to know what was going on inside the Soviet Union, he pretty much had to come to us. And in some ways, it made for a much simpler kind of world. It was a very hierarchical kind of problem. Both the Soviet Union itself was hierarchical, and then if you looked at the sort of the overarching world system at that time, the Cold War was very hierarchical as well. Some people would term it a two-body problem. Two-body problems tend to be very linear. There's a great degree of certainty that goes with linear systems, and I would argue that we had that in mass, certainly from the late 1940s, right up really into the 70s and into the 80s. And then in the 70s and the 80s, we begin to see this transition taking place. Particularly in the 70s, we see the biggest chunk of humanity in the world that had pretty much been self-isolated and of not of too much concern to most people because it was going through its own internal turmoil, begin to open up to the rest of the world. And of course, I'm speaking about China. In the 1980s, we begin to see the cracks appearing in the Soviet Union, and they come to a head in '89 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and of course then in '91 with the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. We see in this time period as well the explosion in cheap international travel. So really in the 1970s and the 80s is when you begin to see huge numbers of people in terms of that we've never seen before begin to be moving around the world much more, and that goes for the American people as well. Up until the 1970s, it was a statistic that I heard that a lot of Americans never went more than 100 miles from their home prior to 1970. And this figure, of course, began to really erode much as we moved through this period. And then finally, right after you have the implosion of the Soviet Union, you have the takeoff of the information technology revolution. And this is that sort of fourth great element of interconnectivity that we talk about. Call the world as you want to call this: explosion in complexity, explosion in interconnectivity, interdependence, convergence. You've heard all the terms used here today. But what we're basically talking about is a world where nothing is really local anymore. Everything is connected to everything else. And it's a world in which people are no longer just receiving broadcast information, even though record numbers of people are receiving it. It's a world in which people have cell phones with them 24 hours a day. They're plugged into the world, and they are transmitting as well. So it's not even just one way anymore. It's mass communications in every direction in this new world, unless, of course, you're a member of the intelligence community in which your phone stays in your car all day, and we sort of disconnect. So that's the kind of challenge that we're dealing with. And in this new world that we're looking at, it truly is an environment which is highly uncertain. It's with that degree of connectivity and that many people, it lends itself to a great degree of nonlinearity. And this is a world for which the current national security apparatus in the U.S. And certainly the intelligence community is not well configured whatsoever. And I'm going to talk a little bit about 8 broad areas that I think the IC is going to have to address. And I think in some ways there's echoes of that for the rest of the government. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about this notion of complexity. I talked about, we've heard all the terms here today in terms of how we characterize that. But it's amazing enough that even here we are in 2015, well past the implosion of the Soviet Union, well past the opening up of China, well past a period where people now tend to have their computers with them 24 hours a day, we still often find ourselves in an environment where we're debating how much has really changed. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is talking to groups of analysts around the IC, and one of the things I ask them is, this whole notion of the world is increasingly complex. How many of you agree with that? And I'll usually get most people to raise their hands. And then when I ask them to talk about what it means in terms of change for what we do, most of them will say no. And the argument that they'll use to say no is that the world has always been complex, right? The world has always been interconnected, right? There's, from the time of the steamship to the telegraph to the radio to the invention of the airplane, all of these marked significant increases in complexity, and therefore what we're dealing with now is really just more of the same. And the answer then for them a lot of the time is, all we have to do to deal with this more of the same is we just need to get better at what we've always done. So you hear the old, we're just going to do what we've always done, but we're going to get back to the basics of it. We're going to do it better. We're going to do it faster. We're going to do it stronger, right? But we're still going to do what we've always done. And I would argue that we're in a position now where doing what we've always done is not going to get us there. Doing what we've always done is going to get us into sort of that Einstein kind of world of insanity, right? Where things have changed and you continue to do exactly the same thing. So the thing is, and this is where I talked about getting controversial in terms of implementation, things that we're going to have to do differently are really, really different. So I would just like to take a few minutes to sort of march through what I think some of those things are. Again, I'm talking specifically about the intelligence community, but I would argue there are huge echoes of these changes throughout the U.S. government. The first one is we have a real cognitive challenge in the United States government. So the U.S. government, it recruits for, it tends to self-select for, the intelligence community is notorious for this, for people who tend to be very linear critical thinkers. And by that I mean they're very good at applying those rules of thought that work very well for thinking about linear systems. You all probably do this to some degree. You know the 4 rules of linearity. Number 1 is you tend to see the world as the sum of its parts. This allows you to think of it in additive terms, and therefore you can attack it by breaking it down into its component pieces. That's what most people do. Number 1 is they take very complex problems and they break them down. Number 2, we tend to look for identifiable cause and effect, especially in retrospect. And we often tend to see it in retrospect, and because we see it in retrospect, we assume that it should have been obvious to us before the fact. Number 3, systems that are linear tend to be repeatable. So if you think in linear terms, you tend to expect the system tomorrow to behave just a little bit different, if at all, from how it behaved today, right? This is what allows us to extrapolate the current into the future, which is something we do a lot of in the intelligence community. And then finally, the last characteristics of linear thinking is we tend to anticipate proportional input-output. A little bit of an action will get us a little bit of an output, and a lot of an action will get us a lot of an output. It's a kind of thinking, it tends to run in the background, but we tend to have been brought up. It's been reinforced in us in our educational system as we've gone through it. And it works very well for thinking about problems like the Soviet Union, closed hierarchical problems where the edges are clear. It's a horrible way, really, for thinking about a complex, interconnected, nonlinear world. And we have a problem with this in the intelligence community and in the government writ large, I would argue. We tend to select for people who do very well on bubble tests. These are people who are very good at arriving at the correct answer. The problem with complex systems is there's rarely a correct answer. There is a multitude of possibilities. And this is much harder for us. There's one way to think about this is the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking. We're a great community, I think, when it comes to critical thinking, something that we lash onto. And if you saw all the reports after 9/11, you saw, and as well as the Iraq WMD situation, there was this huge emphasis on we need a lot of critical thinking to improve that. That may have been true, may not have been true, but one of the real fundamental flaws we ignored was the whole emphasis on the failure of imagination, right? Both of those reports, both WMD and 9/11, talked about that. We did very little as a result, and good luck trying to find really great courses on creative thinking in the IC. It's often most thought of one of those things that either you can do it or you can't do it, but it's not something that can be taught. Not really true. All of us have had this in us from the time we were young. Just the educational system and the system of thought that we've been raised in has been drumming it out of us from a very young age, and it becomes a situation where you have to reignite it, recultivate it, and that's not an easy thing to do, but it can be done. It also requires you to have people who think differently, right? And this is something that's hard for us a lot of the time. The number one rule for getting a job in the American intelligence community is going to still be, can this person get a security clearance, right? Which means this is going to be somebody who's going to be a rule follower, right? And that's true, and we need that, obviously. But obviously people who tend to be extraordinarily creative are often not just creative in how they just think about problems, but they're also creative in how they live their lives. And this can be challenging for us. I don't think it's a challenge that's going to go away. Obviously, security has to be paramount, but it is something to grapple with and can put us into an uncomfortable place to discuss sometimes. So we have a cognitive problem that we have to address. Next, I would argue we have a pretty big organizational problem as well. So you're probably all familiar with the organizational psychology that says that organizations tend to look a lot like the problem that they were created to address. And that is certainly the case of the IC, right? We were created to address a hierarchy, and we are an extraordinary hierarchy, as is the U.S. government writ large, with everything sort of breaking down as you go down to the various departments and to the various agencies and so forth. And this is what gets back to this whole of government issue that was raised right before I started speaking, is what do we need to look like organizationally as a government in this community if we're going to effectively address this kind of world? Well, odds are we probably need to look much flatter than we are, much more networked. And that's a very hard thing to do in any bureaucracy. Finding a truly networked bureaucracy, I don't know if you will, so I'm not sure how we address it, but we have a true organizational challenge ahead of us. And this gets down to an unbelievable degree of slicing and dicing of issues I talked earlier about, this tendency to break things down, and that complex systems have to be looked at holistically. Very difficult to do if the government is completely hierarchical. So we have this organizational challenge. Third, I would argue we have a pretty big behavioral challenge. Here I'm talking mostly to the IC, but it goes larger than that. And I would say within the intelligence community, most analysts, if you talk to them, would assume automatically that they are relevant. And they would assume that relevance based on the fact that they come out of a community that at one time had, as I mentioned earlier, exclusive insight into the problem set, right? So if you wanted to know what was happening inside the Soviet Union, you really needed to come to the intelligence community, right? The intelligence community had the means, if anybody did, to tell you that something was going on and what it was there. But in today's world, that is not necessarily the case at all. In fact, we find that policymakers tend to be extraordinarily well informed. Often probably better informed than we are, right? They're plugged into the world, right? They have the TV on in their office 24 hours a day, giving them a feed as to what's happening around the world. The next day, they're reading the initial analysis, a form of collection and some basic analysis in the newspapers of record, right there on their home computers. They're plugged into the world, right? And those networks don't go away once they come into government. And they're constantly talking to their networks, right? They know business people, they know colleagues who are traveling or moving around the world and tend to have insight into the areas in which they're interested. 4, they're Googling like mad, so they're doing their own bit of intelligence collection and analysis in that form. And then they're getting input from the intelligence community that is often built around classified information, right? And the problem with the world that we're dealing with today is, it may have been in the case of the Soviet Union where it was a problem of a lack of information, but today we're dealing with a world where the problem is we're drowning in information and in good information, right? So I come out of the China community. I lived in Asia for a lot of years. And in the China community, we always joke that the only bad information about China is official Chinese government statistics, right? But otherwise, you're really awash in really great information on China, on Russia. There's people all over. They're walking around. They're carrying their cameras and their cell phones. They're taking pictures. They're uploading it to the web. It's just a massive. So the problem today, if you're trying to think about this world, is not one where you're starving for information. It's one where can you make sense of the mass of information that is out there? It's a sense-making problem. And in this way, this is a challenge for the IC because we're used to thinking about the world as a collection problem. But this world we're dealing with today is not a collection problem, it's a cognition problem, which lashes us back to that earlier issue that I brought up. It's how do you think about it? And of course, all 8 of these things that I'm going to talk about are very, very interdependent. So it's very hard to address one without addressing the other. And this is what makes it daunting. It's hard because you really aren't going to get there by sort of tinkering around the edges. And when you look at it at the end, I think you'll see that it's a pretty wholesale big change. So we have a behavioral problem, and that is we can no longer assume that relevance. We're going to have to behave a little bit differently to remain relevant. Number 4, methodologies, right? So in terms of how we think about the world, a lot of analysts traditionally didn't even have a lot of method, right? Or their method was just, they would just sit there, they would look, and then they would write. But there was a lot of methodologies that are being employed out there in in all kinds of corporations and in academia that are extraordinary for thinking about complex problem sets. And particularly, I'm talking about the more synthetic methodologies like wargaming, red teaming, scenario work. You're probably all familiar with a lot of this. Things that have often been sort of niche capabilities in the IC, they are, but not necessarily the stuff of the mainstream analyst. And this is something that I would argue really is going to have to change. These kinds of things have to become much more mainstream. There tend to be very collaborative methodologies. Again, I talked about those stovepipes. Stovepipes are often an inhibitor to collaboration. So we're not going to get to the one without the other. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of synthetic methodologies that aid us in thinking about the whole that are going to have to become a part of the IC, and even well beyond that, obviously, throughout the U.S. government in terms of how it thinks about its problems. The fifth one I talk a little bit about tends to be about technology, and in particular about visualization. Traditionally, analysts tell their story in text. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Peter Senge and the fifth discipline, but the whole notion that text needs to be, as Senge writes, text needs to be something inherently suspect when it's describing a complex system. You really need to be visualizing and making pictures. From an analytic standpoint in the IC, we often tend to think about visualization at the end of the analytic product. But I would argue that it needs to become something that everybody uses, and not just in the IC, but government-wide. If you're thinking about complex systems, you need to be thinking about visualization early in that process. You need to be looking at it in graphical forms. And that is often hard. We're a very well-educated community. We tend to be used to writing. I won't say we're necessarily always the best writers. Sometimes our style gets the best of us. But it's not going to be enough to write to understand this community. We're going to have to be able to visualize. And this actually brings me to the next point I want to talk about. It was a little bit about our language, our terminology. So the terminology of the U.S. government writ large in the post-World War II era, and even continuing today, as well as in the IC, if you look at our metaphors, tends to be a very mechanistic kind of language, right? It's inertia, momentum, trajectory, leverage, tension. This is the language of Newtonian mechanics. We're all very used to it. We use it in an almost unthinking format. But we're trying to use that terminology to describe a world that is extraordinarily organic. It is not mechanical. Now I talk about that, so you really need to use metaphors that are not Newtonian mechanical. You need to use metaphors that are much more biological or much more ecological, meteorological. Choose your complex system of choice, your organic system, but not Newtonian mechanical. And when I talk about this, sometimes people push back and they say, well, you're making, it's much ado about figures of speech, that's all they are, they're not a big deal. But we know from the cognitive linguistic research of the last 40 years that nothing could be further from the truth, that in fact, our language and our metaphors are the main models upon which our thinking is derived. You have the wrong metaphor, you have the wrong mental model, you are setting yourself and anybody who's reading that up for surprise. So it's anything but a minor point. So we have a terminological challenge, and of course this is not just an IC problem. It's in many ways very much a U.S. government problem writ large, and maybe even a Western problem, right? If you look at Far Eastern metaphors, they tend to be much more organic in format. Seventh, we have an evaluation problem in terms of what we tend to measure both in the IC and in the government writ large. So you've all heard the famous Peter Drucker quote, you get what you measure. Well, in the IC, and I would argue in the government writ large, we tend to measure production, right? How much stuff do we turn out, right? It's a very industrial age metric. And it is not a metric that works very well in an information truly complex kind of age. So the question is how do we change those metrics? The thing about production metrics, about measuring how much stuff you put out, is it's easy, right? There's a certain degree of accountability goes with it. It's easy to count things, and that's what we tend to do. But however, if you look at some of the more successful companies in the world today, and I'll point to Silicon Valley in this sense, and who's doing very well, they're not working off of these industrial counting of metrics. Google doesn't count lines of code people write. They measure behaviors, or at least they're trying to. And I think it's something that we need to spend a little bit more time as a government and as a community writ large thinking about what is it that we're measuring, because we're going to get what we measure. And I'm not sure that production is a great metric from which to hinge off of. Finally, I want to talk about sort of the eighth issue, and this is sort of the third rail of Intel reform. This is a tough one and goes related to all the ones I've talked about already. And this is the informational one, right? This is the one that goes to this whole idea that, again, we're drowning in really good open source information. And the question is how do you bring that in and make that a primary part of what you do? Now, this is something that is just at odds with the history and the experience of the intelligence community. It can also often be at odds with the history and the experience of the U.S. government, right? Which we tend to put a lot of credence in things when they're classified, right? We have, you've heard about the so-called secrecy heuristic, right? People, the same information, if they're told it's classified, will give it a lot more weight than if it's not. And the question is how do we get past that heuristic? Because the fact of the matter is, again, there is so much great information out there in the open if we can just find a way to utilize it. So I would argue that this whole informational thing is a real challenge for us writ large, and one that the community and the government is going to have to deal with. If you look at those things in the aggregate, I think you'll find, since you can't really change one without changing the others because they are all sort of interconnected, you're not talking about an evolutionary change. You're talking about truly a revolutionary change, and that's a very, very difficult thing for any bureaucracy to stomach. I'll be honest, I don't know what that looks like, right? The world that I'm actually describing, I don't know, how necessarily to do it or what it looks like. Obviously, I have some sort of sense of what I think are the characteristics of what this new system needs to look like. But I think if we can't find a way to get there, this whole issue comes back to this existential threat issue that was raised this morning, right? That this is potentially an existential threat, this world that we're dealing with, because none of our governmental structures are really geared to dealing with it. And it's not just structures, it's habits, it's thought processes, it's process, procedures, everything that underpins it. So it is a daunting problem. I'd like to point sort of as a case study and as a cautionary tale to us, to events of a particular company that happened in the last 30 years or so. So some of you may be familiar that in 1969 at Bell Labs, there was something invented called the CCD, the Charged Coupling Device. And the charge coupling device is the basis for the digital sensor. In 1975, Eastman Kodak invented something, some probably know or are aware, that they invented the first digital camera, right? And what did Eastman Kodak do with that camera?
Nothing.
They did nothing with it, right? Other than patent some of the technology, they put it in a drawer. Why? Right. Well, they didn't think anyone would want it to a degree, but what they really thought was this is not what they do, right? They do film. That's right. They do film, they do chemicals, they do paper, they do consumables. That was their line of business, right? They saw the concern of the potential of the digital camera. It wasn't going to work for them, and they put it away. Now, of course, the patents expired, and there were other companies that were doing a lot of research on this because, of course, the charge coupling device was out in the open academic literature. You're familiar with all the companies today, Nikon, Canon, Fuji, most famously. In 1994, Kodak sees the writing on the wall, and they rushed to market with something called the DC-40, one of the first really cheap and rather lousy digital cameras, but it was already way off the pace from where the Japanese firms were. In 2006, I would encourage you actually to go on the internet and type in winds of change in Kodak. You will see a video that Kodak actually made for its workforce. So by 2006, they actually had a management in place at Kodak that sort of saw the reality of the world and saw that they had to make change. They found they had a workforce that did not want to change. And they made this video, actually it was aimed at their workforce, not at the public. It's a great video. It talks about all the things that are commonplace with us today in the digital realm that we're used to using. And it basically says, this is what our future is, and this is what we do. But the fact of the matter is the Kodak workforce actually didn't want to go there. They were chemists, They had joined to make film, to make better slide film, paper, chemicals, and so forth. And some of you may be aware, in 2012, the Eastman Kodak Company, the giant of the industrial age, the company whose name was synonymous with photography, declared bankruptcy and was broken up. And now there are just a few small little rump pieces of it left in very niche markets. And that's what it's become. My point is that Kodak was not driven to irrelevance. It chose to become irrelevant. It made a conscious decision, or you could argue it was an unconscious decision, but any way you look at it, it wasn't killed by its competitors. It was killed by its own inability to recognize that its relevance could actually be in question, and that if it was going to maintain it, it would have to change. And I worry that both the intelligence community, in some ways the U.S. government, is not yet totally grappling with this seriously. I suspect that if we were, things would be much more disruptive than they are right now. Again, I understand the notion that the world, we want to believe that not that much has changed and that we can continue to just get better at doing what we've always done. I think it's a really dangerous place to be. I'm going to wrap up there and just say I think that the writing is on the wall. We just have to make those hard choices and begin jumping into it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's open it up to the floor for any questions. Right here, front, second row.
I'm Sheila Rannes from Welsh College. This is for Mr. Kerbel. Having worked on the project on national security reform, which of course was trying to look holistically at the national security apparatus of the country, we came to many similar conclusions as your remarks. And I'm curious, do you see a role for Congress in helping the U.S. executive branch reform itself with authorities that preclude things like collaboration, not legally, but it sure makes it tough when you're going into an interagency meeting and you've been told to wear the hat of the agency or department you represent. One of our recommendations was to actually fund interagency missions, and Congress freaked out when they saw it. So some of the things that we were exploring were really tough because they had a difficult time accepting some of the assumptions that we were using. And would you care to comment about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I mean, let me repeat, just for safety's sake here, my disclaimer that, again, these are my own personal opinions. And so you get yourself in a situation, I think, where to do this, we all have to be willing to accept that nothing is off the table. There's a lot of changes that probably need to be made. I would argue that just I'm not a congressional scholar, but looking at Congress, it has a lot of the hallmarks of the larger U.S. government and even the IC that I've talked about. It's awfully reductionist. It has committees and subcommittees and subcommittees and all kinds of, there's all kinds of politics, I'm sure, involved in why that is the case. But the fact of the matter is just as everything else is going to have to become more holistic, I would argue that Congress probably does as well. And I'm sure it's scary for the Hill as much as it is for the executive branch. The problem is, I think, you have to just get to these assumptions, to this idea that nothing is going to look the same afterwards. And that's a really scary thing to try and wrestle with. And I guess, part of this is going to be about timing. And at the time of the Project on National Security Reform, I guess Congress wasn't quite there yet. And in that sense, they're no different, I think, than a lot of the government. Time is slipping by on us, it would seem to me. And at some point, we have to stop with admiring the nature of the problem, which we do an awful lot of. And admittedly, there's value in that because, again, as I said, we haven't all even recognized there is a problem yet. But the fact of the matter is sometime we're going to have to do something because the years are flying by, the world is changing. You're all probably familiar that Google said in March of this year that only 40% of the world is online. We have 60% to go. So if you think it's been uncomfortable up to this point, we'll just wait. This is just going to get worse.
Gentlemen, would either of you care to comment on that question? Or that? I'm going to make a comment. I've been pretty well-behaved, but I'm the intergovernmental guy, the interagency guy. And I can say that in my own experience, working over, for example, at the U.S. Agency for International Development, no matter what the specific issue was, in many cases, we felt like the enemy was the State Department or the Defense Department. It's a question of tribalism. I mean, and it's much better now than it was 15 years ago, but there's still a little bit about it there. And I would also say that whenever we talk about whole of government, and we've talked about it so much in the last 15 years, first of all, I think there's a little bit of a backlash, a moving back of the pendulum, but also whenever we have a whole of government event, well, you always have someone from USAID, some people from state, Defense Department, a lot of people from the Defense Department and the military, the intel community, but you almost never have anybody from the Congress. And I'm not talking about members, I'm talking about the staffers. And it's partially my fault. I mean, is anyone here from congressional staff, or does anyone here work on the Hill? Okay, my bad. I do invite people. It's tribal, and it's something that we have to do a lot better at. Some parts of the government are better at it than others, but I think we all have to do a lot better at it. Other questions? I've got a question way up at the top there.
Ben Shepherd from the Institute for Alternative Futures. A question for you, Mr. Kerbel. I'd like to emphasize the importance of creativity and even using like scenarios and wargaming. Could you talk more about how you can use futures tools for their value in the intelligence community, where you would like to ideally see this go over the next few years?
So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to. I come out of a world, where I spent a lot of time working on futures, so I'm familiar with some of the methodology that goes along with it. But really, I would argue that it's just so uneven in its application, and I think a lot of the time, a big part of it is the government doesn't know what to do with it. Right? Even if they have the foresight to sort of latch into it, they're not quite sure of how you act on it. And again, this brings us back to this whole of government issue, right? It goes back to budgetary issues and artificial timelines that are built around, our spending, but it runs across the ability to actually absorb them and use them. I see some amazing futures work get done, some within government, a lot of it, maybe even most of it, outside of government. But then it runs into the trap of what do you actually do with it, right? People love it, it's interesting, but I don't think we do a great job of taking it much further than sort of the interesting conversation, as opposed to really dragging it in to the decision-making process.
Second row right there. Wait for the mic, please. Mic is on its way.
Hi, Chris Holshek. I'm with the Minerva Project on impunity, one of the researchers. This one is kind of going back a little bit to the idea of organizational best and worst practices. You're all kind of students in one way or another of organizational behaviors, organizational reform, and so on. The question I have is, from what you have studied and seen throughout history, whatever, can organizations in fact reform as a result of success versus as a result of failure? Do they? Do you have any examples of that? And perhaps maybe Mr. Cocaine could talk a little bit about the UN and its attempts at reform through the more or less catastrophic failures of the 90s versus the U.S. reform experience.
Thank you, sir. gentleman. Who cares to step up?
Having worked in charge of multiple interagency initiatives, the National Security Council, the Department of State, and other agencies that have had some strategic effect. I mean, you know, I'm not denying in the case of this Hezbollah initiative, and it really is an initiative, that there has been strategic intent and strategic effect to try to stop a terrorist organization from operating a money laundering scheme and a drug trafficking scheme to generate billions of dollars in material support. It's the largest material support case in the history of counterterrorism. But the problem is, even though there's been a great amount of cooperation, even though the bank at the epicenter of this thing was designated, the ultimate end state is still that we're laundering more money for narco-terrorists today, who are using it to fund their operations, by the way, in Syria and in Iraq right now against the United States. So, you know, and I'll challenge anybody in the intelligence community offline to a debate on the facts surrounding this, not here on public, but, you know, there's just a problem of people have very good intentions at the top, but they don't necessarily carry through. I mean, having worked for the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor and ultimately the President in the last administration and worked closely with this administration, I mean, I have no doubt in the sincerity of their intentions, but the problem is follow through. It's very, very difficult. And we're dealing with complexity, as Mr. Kerbel has pointed out, and I applaud his leadership on this and Mr. Cocaine's identification. People in the intelligence community particularly have trouble outside of the counter-narco-terrorism and counter-threat finance elements within it, which are very small, very noble, staffed by some brilliant people, at connecting the dots. They're looking for things that they want a smoking gun piece of intel. They want something to be delivered on a plate. Every single major terrorism financing, narcotics trafficking scheme that I personally, and proliferation network that I pursued operates in plain sight. AQ Khan network, Al-Qaeda, look at the Al-Rashid Trust. It was a fundraiser, it's a charitable entity, you know, Al Haramain Foundation, operating right in the United States. Hezbollah's used car money laundering network. The people are looking for secrets when in fact the secrets are hiding in plain sight. What's secret is who they're really benefiting. But what they're always trying to do is look for this sort of secret magic bullet that's going to, be able to, be shot, that's going to open this thing up in like some Pandora's box and everything will explain itself. It's not the way these organizations operate. They know exactly what our laws are. They know exactly what our procedures are. And they understand our intelligence community sometimes better than we do. And they understand our operational threshold. You know, they know that, we're not necessarily willing to blow up the Lebanese banking system by designating every bank in Lebanon, because it might blow up Lebanon and suddenly we have a civil humanitarian disaster on our hands and even a bigger problem with ISIL. So guess what? Hezbollah can go and launder as much money as it wants to the United States through the exact same schemes that we've already identified, already have been prosecuted, and people are unwilling to act because they do a cost-benefit analysis. My view over time is that erodes the credibility of the whole globalization itself, and it erodes the credibility of the United States government and our own laws and the Europeans. So I apologize for a long answer.
Dave. Mr. Cocaine, you're not going to try to address the UN problem?
Can I make a real quick follow-up on the issue about a successful organization as opposed to a failing organization making the necessary change? And I would argue that it's the U.S. government itself, right? So if you look at in the post right after the Second World War, obviously I think we were in a position of extraordinary success, right? But we were also in a position where we were willing to acknowledge that the assumptions that underpinned our behavior up to that point and the structures around which we were working off of were not going to carry us effectively into this new period, right? So we were going to benefit from a degree of consolidation. If you think about it in terms of the metaphors we often talk about in terms of complexity, you've heard about the collapsing sand pile. We sort of did that to a degree at the end of the war, right? So we decided, we learned some things that having a separate Navy department and a War Department and having the Air Corps as part of it, we reorganized that. We created a central intelligence agency. Whether it was perfect and whether, obviously it had its flaws, but I think we were coming from success to success. And it was an organization, the U.S. government at that time, that, and again, it had certain things going for it, right? We're states, it wasn't necessarily that huge a change, but it was a significant change, and we had a leadership that was willing to recognize it and work through the necessary changes. Political environment probably is a little bit different today. getting a degree of leadership, where people agree in the leadership as to what has to be done, is a challenge, obviously. But to me, I think our best example as a government is our own, right? We've done this before, and this is where I think really where the PNSR was actually trying to go, which is it was trying to lay out there this kind of National Security Act of 2012 or whatever year it was, or at least the outlines of what it would have been. And I know it was heartbreaking for a lot of us who were either on the edges of it or involved in it or watching it, that it just didn't go there.
Okay, we have a question right there in the front row, and then in the third row on that side.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. My own perception is the most difficult thing to do is to change the way people think, feel, and behave. And it doesn't happen overnight. Often it takes generations. But we have an expectation. My perception is that it came when Bob McNamara came and went up to the Hill and had all these wonderful numbers he brought in from Ford Motor Company and turned that into counting how well the Defense Department did by the number of body bags. So you end up with all the wrong metrics. My own view about this is that if you want them to change, you have to build, if you want collaboration, you need to build it into their performance plan. And you ask them, who have you shared information with and who shared information with you? That doesn't strike me as so hard, but nobody's willing to do it. But it takes leadership. And part of the thing we have to do is look for leaders who are willing to lead into these directions rather than feeling if I say this, I'm going to get penalized.
Thank you. We have a question in the third row.
Tom Vernick, Office of Naval Intelligence. It's kind of a two-part question, one for Mr. Corbell. With the pending retirement of so many in the DoD, the young 13s and 14s are going to be, I guess, for lack of a better term, yoked with the mantle of leadership here very soon, within the next 5 to 10 years. Do you see that as a good time to affect some of the change that needs to happen within the IC? And for Dr. Asher, there are certainly factions within the IC that do not agree with you that Hezbollah is a transnational criminal organization, and within the law enforcement communities there's the same. How do you think we can work towards consensus with that? Because leveraged together, we can do so much more damage.
So to the issue about the pending sort of assumption of power by the 13s and 14s in a younger generation. So I'm hopeful about that, but I also have concerns. So I talk to a lot of analysts who are at those levels, and it's amazing to me, I never cease to be amazed at how quickly, from the time they've come into the community to how quickly they've consumed the Kool-Aid. And are often, and this goes to the metrics issue again, they see what they're being measured, and they very quickly adopt the prevailing structure, and before they know it, they're card-carrying believers in that. And it's been funny because I've been finding, as of late at least, that it's higher grades, people who've been around even longer, who tend to express greater frustration with the IC than the people who are kind of new to it. Now that may change, particularly with the money that was available so much since 2001. Things are much tighter now. There's going to be fewer promotion opportunities, but I worry that that's going to lead those generations to actually leave, as opposed to stay. So that's not going to help us necessarily either. I hate it sound like everything I'm saying is so depressing, but it kind of sounds that way. But so I have hope. There's a possibility. Obviously, it's a generation that tends to be much more comfortable with the technology and the notion of being connected 24 hours a day, and that actually chafes about having to be disconnected. So that's a positive. So I'm just not sure of how it's going to play out on balance.
Tom, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting question, and I think that the problem is we're dealing with a community that thinks that everything exists within its community walls. And having worked on undercover investigations with the Drug Enforcement Administration, it says DEA's Drug Enforcement Agency somehow in my bio. It's not supposed to be there. I never put that there. It's an administration, and it's an administration of agents that are in charge for conducting undercover investigations in partnership frequently with the Department of Defense and other agencies to provide support in the intel levels. And their own sort of classified way, i.e., we penetrate banks. We get inside. If you read the Lebanese-Canadian Bank complaint inside the Southern District of New York, it's incredibly detailed. On X day, X thing happened. X security officer of Hezbollah did this. Money went from this account to that account. Where do you think we get this information, people? Now, does the IC have access to grand jury sensitive law enforcement information or information that may be proceeding toward a court case? No. But we do put out these complaints, and they're extraordinarily detailed. What do you think it comes? It just magically appears? The people who have a sworn oath and could be prosecuted in federal court and would be prosecuted if we lied to judge and jury, our credibility is less than yours? Seriously, give me a break. You know, we took down the Gambino crime family. We took down the Medellin drug cartel. Pablo Escobar, you know, by the way, it was a great partnership with a lot of people. But let me tell you, the same techniques have been used over and over again to penetrate organizations that are extremely secretive. Okay? And what people don't get is that terrorists would engage in narcotics trafficking or illicit financing scheme. What better way to spread the wings of resistance and to expand your base building of your network to be able to get people involved in crime? And if you can control a banking system in a place like Lebanon, in effect, and I would argue there's multiple terrorist organizations operating through Lebanon right now, you can attract tremendous amounts of followers around the world. Now, whether they're members or followers or affiliates doesn't really matter, because it's all about the strategic end state. And the end state is ultimately disrupting the power and unity effort of the Westphalian and the Western system of global governance. I mean, read the Iran revolutionary speeches of Ayatollah Khomeini, and describe us as the arrogance. Now, maybe things are changing in that relationship right now, but I can tell you this: on the criminal level, there is, as I argued, a criminal resistance happening, and whether we can settle things on a nuclear front with the Iranians or not. Much like in the case of North Korea, which was a total criminal state, and by the way, which we totally penetrated, not just in the case of Banco Delta. If you look at the unsealed indictments in the Southern District of New York from 2005, you will see that we penetrated their financial system. We had undercover meetings with the head of their intelligence service and with Chinese three-star generals who were engaged in buying 2,000 man pads from U.S. undercover FBI agents. It's all documented. This is not fiction. We can't put it into the court system if it's a lie. We'll go to jail, unlike a lot of people in the intelligence community, who put forward, immense lies when I was at the State Department and convinced us to go to war in Iraq.
Okay, let's just do one more question, and I see it right over there.
Great panel. Tom Goldberg with Lineage Technologies. I'm used to giving my own fear, uncertainty, and doubt talks, but this has eclipsed all of that. So, not that I am a cancer patient, but it sounds very much like I have a panel of physicians in front of me trying to tell me what my prognosis is and whether I have 6 months to a year to live. So where's the inflection point? Where do we find the moment where our policy leaders will begin to wake up to the sense of urgency that you all are professing here? Thanks.
Thank you, sir. James, you want to reflect on that?
I don't know exactly where it is, but I think it probably comes from public opinion. I mean, I fully understand that in a defense establishment there's a premium on pessimism, but it's striking for a foreigner, of which I am one, not only because I work for the UN, but because I'm from Australia. It's striking for a foreigner to hear a group of American leaders say, we don't know what our idea is. I mean, American culture is a culture of exceptionalism, and it's a culture of exceptionalism for good reasons, possibly for some other reasons as well, but for good reasons, because of what this country has achieved over several centuries. The competition to govern that I was talking about is a competition that is won ultimately in minds. It's about convincing people that what we have to offer, and by we I don't mean America and Australia and the UN, I mean the responsible statehood model, that is a better model for governing your life than all of these other things you might buy into. And right now, in some parts of the world, we're losing that argument badly because the states that we support, and I do include the UN here, are not responsible. They are irresponsible. They govern their citizens' lives in ways that keep them marginalized or repressed, or that produce very bad economic outcomes for them. So there is a loss of faith in the model of the state as a system of government, and people are looking for alternatives. The idea that we should be promoting is that statehood, responsible statehood, is something worth keeping and worth fighting for, and that where there are states that are not performing, they will be held to account and will be made better to serve their citizens than they are. And where there are alternatives emerging, we can work with or talk to those alternatives, whether it is a tribal alternative or some other alternative, not necessarily based on secular statehood, but possibly on more religious models. But there are certain fundamental principles that we've all agreed, namely the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which must be respected. If your system of government doesn't live up to those fundamental principles that we've agreed, then we should fight that system of government tooth and nail. But what we're failing to do is appreciate that the heart of the matter is one of strategic communication. If you're going to win this competition, you have to win it in people's minds. And if we're not even winning it at home, so there's not even the public pressure on our leadership, our political leadership, to take this fight more actively through more active, coordinated strategic communications to the rest of the world, then I don't think we'll reach that inflection point. It has to begin with popular opinion, I think. That's the only thing that politicians will ever respond to.
An order that we benefit from in the global commons, and there is a global commons, and there is a system of rules and precedents and protocols. And James, thank you for what you've done and said. But it's not being protected. It's not being policed. We actually are beginning to understand how much it's corrupted and how much it's breaking down. And look at the work that Scott Helfstein did on the incredible network of all these illicit actors around the world for the Combating Terrorism Center. You know, when you actually visualize it and put it into a Palantir or some other data network analysis tool, it's really shocking to see the sophistication, scale, and scope of these illicit networks. But the idea that actual governments are directing these illicit networks, whether it's Putin's Russia, Kim Jong-il's North Korea, terrorist organizations that are sort of proto-governments like Hezbollah, parts of governments like the IRGC Quds Force, terrorist organization and movements, which we haven't seen since the days of Saladin, like ISIL. The fact that they would engage in some forms of illicit conduct in order to garner profit and power should surprise no one. What I'm surprised by is we are not using this incredible opportunity to wipe these guys out. We have the ability, by enforcing our laws, actually, to deny them huge amounts of financial sustenance, to basically take them out of the international system, including the governments that are backing them, until they come back into compliance. We went after North Korea. We indicted them in federal court for counterfeiting our currency. Their currency was being printed at a higher quality than our own currency, believe it or not, on their own central bank's printing presses, and they were distributing the counterfeit currency with guys like Sean Garland of the official IRA and other notorious terrorists all over the world, as well with the Chinese Sun Yat triad and the many other triads and illicit partners. But we proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. It had a strategic effect for a while, but if we had done things right, we would have done what I recommended and what Secretary Powell recommended, and that is bring it to the International Criminal Justice System, bring it to the International Criminal Court, haul all the information in front of the whole world, show them exactly what they're doing, and by the way, use that evidence to take away billions of dollars in North Korean bank accounts we'd identified through grand jury subpoenas of banks around the world, as well as through intelligence, and freeze the money. Because you can do it based on drugs, money laundering, and counterfeiting. You may not be able to do that on weapons proliferation. We had the ability to put these people and bring them to their knees. And then they would have faced an existential choice between nuclear existence as a threatening state or peace and partnership with the legal world. And we could do that if we wanted to. We just don't have the guts.
So I guess for me, I share your sense of incredulity that we're still not, ready to make a move here. That we're still debating the nature of the problem. I'm sure there's a leadership component to it. I'm sure there's an educational component to it. I tend to live amongst a lot of people who I would think kind of get it, and we're all sort of amazed that oftentimes the conversation, both the political discourse, but even beyond that, seems to be focused on what would be the entirely wrong things. I guess for me it comes down to, I'm a real big believer in, you lead by example. And I think that the greatest thing that the United States could do is if we could change ourselves to comport with this sort of new world. I think that as a state, so many of the struggles which we seem to be wrestling with, we would actually do pretty well. I mean, that process would be messy. But I think as an example for the future of the state, because I'm a big believer in that states do have a future, but they're going to have to look a little bit different than they do today. But what better state to do it than ours, I would argue. But it requires, some leadership. It requires a real conversation focused on real issues, not the latest little thing of the day, I guess. But I am amazed, actually, that even at this point in 2015, we still have to talk about bringing people on board with the notion that the world is really a very different place. And we do. It's troubling and scary, but I think with a real conversation, it's surmountable.
I have a great concern that American exceptionalism leads to a sense of historical immunity, and that we respond to complexity with complication rather than creativity. Just try to get anything done at any time, and you'll know what I mean, and that this will lead to a failure of imagination. With that, will you join me in thanking this group of panelists? And let's take 15, and remember, those of you who endured to the very end get to participate in the Good Wine and Good Champagne networking event. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, can you take your seats so we can proceed with this fourth and final panel, the fourth phase, phase 4 of our conference on Beyond Convergence. We didn't want to end the conference on a note of gloom and doom. Cancer patients, nothing can be done. The fact is that we do know certain things can be done. We often don't do them. As I said this morning, a lot of the puzzle pieces are there, but what we do with them makes a lot of difference. If you'll remember, Dr. Treverton wanted to examine the potential role of the United States and of China. We tend to focus often on an adversary or the conditions that are affecting us without reflecting on what we do. In this last panel, that emerged, that how we respond to the challenges makes a lot of difference in the outcome. There are a lot of things that we can do, and although Ms. Lockhart isn't able to join us, she regrets that she can't speak today. She's lost her voice. As I said, Assistant Secretary Rick Barton agreed to not fill in for Claire Lockhart, but to share his experience, which you can read in his biography, and discuss some of the things that we can do and should be doing. And without further introduction, I'll just, as I've done all day, just go directly to the panel and ask that you hold any applause and questions until both panelists have spoken, and then we'll do the audience questions. Okay? Let's go.
Thanks very much, Michael. Whoa, you can hear me all right, I guess. I'll take out my hearing aids. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I did see Claire Lockhart here, and it is difficult to fill in for her, but I will certainly offer my own views. What Michael had asked was that we spend some time talking on state building and the concept of state building, and so what I'd like to do is to share kind of how I see it, and then talk about some of the challenges in the way we go after this work, how we need to change our own practices if we're going to be more effective in trying to promote stable states around the world. And I think that I also want to just compliment the last panel, because I did hear most of the question and answer period, and I thought they were just unusually candid and outspoken and well worth hearing. So it's a high bar that they've set, and we'll certainly try to meet that. And I'll try to be as brief as possible, because it did look like there were a lot of questions and comments here, and I want to make sure that I speak to what's most on your mind after a day of discussion. But I'd like to start off with this whole concept of nation and state building, because I think it's gotten a little bit overwrought, and it's exceeded my sense of ambition and what we are likely to be able to accomplish. And in my own view, it's something that's incredibly desirable, but that our role as the United States, and probably as the international community in most of these places, is to really jumpstart places. It's not to take responsibility or ownership for state building or nation building. And we've gotten really carried away over time in trying to do so many things in very, very difficult places that we obviously haven't succeeded. And in a way, we've diminished the importance of the work through our failures and through our overreaching and our lack of focus. And that's something we cannot afford, because obviously we need stable partners everywhere that we go. And so the first thing that I want to do is make sure that we understand that there's still plenty that can be done when you downscale your ambition to just giving people a fighting chance to make it on your own. You still probably have more ambition than you are likely to achieve. So it's not that big a step It's still over the top, but I think it is addressable. And clearly, when we go into these very, very tough places, what you have to do is to take nearly impossible problems and turn them into addressable problems. And that means, what's the first step? And in Africa, they talk about how do you make a meal out of a live elephant. And I used to think that the way you do it is you sort of get creative and you'd think, wait for the elephant to lie down and then find a place that doesn't have many nerve endings and maybe take a bite out of it while it's sleeping. But somebody came along more recently and gave me, a more constructive view, and they said, actually, what you're probably going to do is you're going to live off of the dung droppings for some time. And that did seem, there's the kind of adjusted ambition that I think you may need for this whole challenge. So the first thing I wanted to do is to take a look at how we go at these places. And historically, when the United States went into almost any of these fragile states, we would go in with some kind of military assistance, some sort of food, maybe elections, probably AIDS. That was sort of our care package. And so when the president would announce we have a $250 million initiative, you could pretty well count on almost all the money coming out of those existing buckets. More recently, obviously, we've had the anti-drugs and the anti-terrorism, and health has gotten a little broader, but nevertheless, it's still pretty much the same standard definition. And if you look at studies such as this recent U.S. Army study, or study done for the Army, assessing security cooperation as a preventive tool, which it basically says almost none of these countries are in a place where they can actually take particular advantage of what we're doing, and it has had almost no stabilizing effect whatsoever. We obviously need to ask, okay, what's wrong with this picture and how are we going to be more effective? This is not unique to the United States. I've worked in the United Nations for a couple of years and was an ambassador in New York for a couple of years, and I can assure you that the mistakes that we make are pretty much replicated by most of our friends. This is not unique to us. But I think we have to ask ourselves the question, if those have been the typical lines of assistance, have they really helped? Have they really made a difference? And I would argue not as much as they should. And I would also argue that if you look at things like the United Nations sending a 41-person assessment mission to post-earthquake Haiti, that you've got probably something that's going to get more complicated before it gets better. But also, if you look at our Iraq redux right now, it certainly looks like the response that we've come up with to that challenge sounds and feels a lot like what we were trying to do for a number of years. And so you have to question whether we're being as creative there in that space as well. So what I'd like to do is take most of the remaining time to just recommend kind of a 5-step preferred approach that I think will make us more effective in these places, and maybe speak to some of the challenges that the earlier panel also raised. And I'd like to do it from some of my own experience. When I was at CSIS, I started out, this started off as the 3 chronic problems that we encountered when we intervened in places. But I so depressed the first 2 audiences that I spoke to that I had to change the subject to the 5 critical elements of success. So this is the 5 critical elements of success, as opposed to the 3 chronic mistakes that we always make, because it's more, it has more resonance with an American audience. So the first one the first place that we need to improve and we've got to pay more attention to is we have to get to know the place and figure out what is most important. It's not hard for somebody to go to any one of these places and figure out that there are 15 or 25 things that need to be done. But figuring out what's most important actually takes a high degree of self-discipline. And it really runs against the way we are structured, which is people in various lanes showing up to make the argument that the lane that they swim in happens to be the most important one for this occasion. Now, that obviously has not worked, and I would just offer another metaphor here for your consideration, and that is that these places are, if you insist on thinking of them as a swim meet, which they are not, you can at least change your metaphor to these are events that take place in a swimming pool, but it happens to be water polo rather than a swim meet. Nobody's in any lane. You get pushed to the bottom of the pool every time you move to do anything. There's actually a goal to be scored. You got many of the same skill sets, but it's actually a very different competition than the one that you've been used to. And so our bureaucratic ways don't really put us into a place to get to know this space anywhere near as possible. There's an internal competition now within the U.S. government of about 200 people that are prognosticating what's supposed to happen, and most of them are in the intelligence community. In our office at CSO, we had the number 2 and 3 prognosticators, and the biggest advantage they had is complete and total access to open source information. That was it. And I mean, they can't. It's not because they're smarter than everybody else, but when you only have 5 people in one office and they're competing against people who have thousands of people, and they keep coming in as being very competitive, it must be because they are more open to more information, and that is their competitive advantage. So we got to do that in these. Number 1, you've got to know the place and figure out what's most important. Number 2, you have to focus real, genuine, measurable effort on 1 or 2 priorities. So if people say the meeting, a typical meeting in the U.S. government will start with, what can we all do? And the question really should be, what is most needed and what is most important? And then, what can we do? So that's a very different question, and again, it doesn't get asked that way very often. But I would say that security is generally the precondition for progress, and we almost never do enough with police and community safety. So that's a pretty strong opportunity that exists, and I think some of the comments from the last panel reinforce that. But you have to define your ambition early on, and it should be very focused. Number 3, you have to engage and depend on local people. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to find George Washington there. You can put Hamid Karzai on just so many white horses and walk him across the cover of Newsweek magazine, and he's still not going to be George Washington. But we keep replicating that mistake or that desire, and it doesn't really work. So most of these places are hollowed out shells by the time they get our attention, and we haven't paid that much attention to them historically. You couldn't say that Afghanistan, the 10 years before we went in there, that we had really spent much time thinking about it, and that was certainly pretty true of Iraq as well. We didn't, again, but they are hollowed out shells. If you, for example, are a talented leader in any of those if you have any political talent in one of those countries, you're likely to end up dead, in London, co-opted, or decided to go into the family business of making cheese or something else. So that's the kind of that's just at the leadership level, and of course it happens everywhere. So we have to go subnationally. We have to test people and partners, and this is one of the places that we can actually learn a tremendous amount. Many more pilots, much more learning by doing. I don't know why we can't use the concept of experiment much more aggressively. We had a family friend who invented the plate glass process, Alistair Pilkington. And when you asked him, how did you do it? He said, well, for 4 years I went into the laboratory every day and I broke glass. He said, I have the world record for broken glass. But he also had the patent for plate glass because he was the guy who figured out the zinc float process. And we've got to be willing to do that. I mean, these things are certainly these places are as complicated as any invention like plate glass, much more so actually. And we have to be ready to test people, invest in them, see who produces, and move them up the process as a result of those series of tests. The 4th point, we've got to find real-time measurements. The only really good evaluations that I have seen in the government and the UN tend to be postmortems. That doesn't really help you do the job. if I was a chief executive of any organization and somebody said, look, 2 years after your leave, somebody's going to come in here and write a damning report of how badly you did, I'd say, well, thanks very much. That was, I won't invest in that. But real time, real criticism, real independence, booked at the very front end of everything you try to do, making sure it's not a friend who's just going to tell you what you want to hear. I mean, these are all constants, and we can obviously do better there. And fifth, getting back to what was said in the earlier panel, you've got to communicate your ambition and your progress pretty much all the time. These places are so problematic that if you think you can get by with an every 6-month report and every year-long report, you're just crazy. You've got to constantly reassure, first off, the people of the place that something is happening, that some progress is being made, and that they are going to be the beneficiaries of it. But you also have to do the same thing for other donors. You have to do that for our taxpayers. And clearly, the way that we have gotten into most of these situations by having not particularly thorough conversations with our publics, and then asking them to believe in everything we're doing and to trust us when we didn't trust them at the front end to actually be part of the conversation doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. But you got to build enthusiasm. You have to have a sense of progress. And I'm a huge believer in all forms of communication. A lot of the stuff that we did at CSO was built around improved communication. So the only independent FM system in the history of Syria now exists, and it's run by the opposition. It's not content controlled by the U.S. government, but it's there giving the opposition and the people of that country a chance to actually hear a voice that is not the one that has been offered by the Assad family for 40 years. And I would say that if we had one thing you could do in a lot of these places, if I could play any one role in a whole heck of a lot of these shaky states that we've been talking about, I'd just assume be Rupert Murdoch as anybody else. If I had complete dominance of the market and I could communicate with people as freely as I want, that would be to me one huge strategic advantage that I would want to have. So, I think just finally, I'd like to say that I think I haven't had a chance to read the new national security strategy, but I've read a few stories about it, and I think that the way that Susan Rice talked about differentiating between crises is really important. I mean, we can build almost every single problem that we face into Y2K, Ebola, the world is going to end. They'll be in New York in 10 minutes, and then find that we have 50,000 Hondurans in Texas at the same moment. And so we really got to recognize, evaluate each of these crises rather individually, independently, and not fall prey to what I think in Washington is a very industrialized view of these problems, which tends to reflect where people are paid to sit. And that's not a good way to get a good analytical overview of these challenges. So I hope that provides you a little bit of food for thought, and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
I have the slides that are coming up, hopefully. I see them back there. Do you have the clicker? You've always taught me to keep my hand on the trigger. So what I've been asked to do is actually take a look at solution sets, right? So every panel, actually, we've talked about so what? So why is this all important, this idea of convergence? So I had the privilege of being here at NDU in 2007, where I designed the first actual course on the nexus between terrorism and crime, and had to go before the academic board to actually explain why this was of national security importance. It delights me and thrills me that A, we produced the book Convergence, that the chairman actually now assigns apparently to his young staffers on the joint staff, and that we're having a whole day looking at this concept of convergence. What I'm going to try to do as the last and wrap-up speaker is try to sum up what we looked at, but more importantly, explain from a national security strategy lens what we're trying to do in order to confront this complexity of threats to our national security, and then more importantly, really highlight the role that the government can no longer do it all. and really look at how we will use public, private, civic sector partnerships going forward. And I'll actually give you all an assignment as a professor. It's a privilege that we have to do, how we have to, each one of us in our own spheres of influence, really take on the mantle of being responsible for national security and making those who we have impact on, whether it's our peers, our neighbors, or our children, to be much more conscious of how national security is the responsibility of a whole of society, not a whole of government. So let's first take a look at what's on the plate of our colleagues at the National Security Council. Don't have to tell you that ISIL has been on the newsreel 24/7, and more importantly, the situation in both Iraq and Syria deteriorates every day. What hasn't really been covered has been the real humanitarian crisis of the refugees, of which Ambassador Barton's office has been intimately involved since the very beginning of the civil war in Syria, which is now in its 4th year. We've also seen the impact of Boko Haram, a group that very few people actually knew about probably 2 years ago, and the fact that, I don't know if you followed this, the instability in Nigeria has forced them to actually postpone their presidential elections by 3 weeks. So these are small groups using asymmetrical abilities to really be change agents in these different parts of the world. Big debate now over radical Islam and the West, most espoused and more importantly epitomized by the attacks in Paris. One of the earlier panels talked about, well, how could someone who's a supporter of ISIL be also then collaborating with a supporter of AQAP? We cannot limit ourselves in terms of imagination, and more importantly, this belief that people would be so loyal to a certain kind of interpretation of radical Islam that they would actually not collaborate. And hopefully today we've actually been able to show how these networks interact, whether it be philosophically, but even more importantly, transactionally and opportunistically. Russia-Ukraine, it's a much more kind of traditional state-on-state conflict. We've actually seen how that's actually creating tremendous pressures within the European Union and the United States. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, was here yesterday meeting with President Obama and basically trying to figure out which instruments of national power would actually change the behavior of what we call an adventurous Putin. If we go to the other side, we look at what's happening in Central America. My colleagues Phil Williams and Doug Farah actually really described, I think, what's happening in Central America. A threat to sovereignty and the basic rights of people, average people, to be able to live in a prosperous and safe community. And we've also been the ones who've seen the exodus of up to 70,000 unaccompanied children from the northern triangle of Latin America coming to the United States to escape violence, but more importantly, to come towards economic and educational opportunity. Afghanistan hasn't really been on the news because ISIL's almost kind of taken it over, but we're still now continuing a presence of 10,000 troops there to hopefully preclude what had happened with our dramatic pullout in Iraq. A rising China, as you've seen in the National Security Strategy, which was launched on Friday. It's this idea of rebalancing and looking at Asia Pacific, which will be the fastest growing economy and more importantly societies in the future, the rest of this century. And other things that we didn't anticipate. If you were to ask any of our colleagues who are in the uniformed service that you would expect 6,000 of our military actually deployed to deal with an issue such as Ebola and global pandemics. These are things that we didn't necessarily plan for, which also creates strains budgetarily and also from a human resources of how and where we're going to do even more with even less. Then lastly, Iran and North Korea in terms of their nuclear aspirations. It's a big piece of state on state. They all want to become part of that nuclear club. And more importantly, we're trying to use different sanctions regimes, different persuasions, and these negotiations with Iran are coming to a head now that involve not just Iran and the P5+1, but more importantly, Israel, right? And the impending visit of Bibi Netanyahu here to Washington. Underneath all of these, what I would call localized kind of crises, you have this idea also of a new domain, which is cyber. Everything we do as individuals, and we've actually just seen one of the biggest breaches of healthcare insurance with the Anthem breach this past week. Everything we do, we are not immune to attacks, whether they be perpetrated by nation states or by criminals. It's a new world where we have to balance cybersecurity with privacy. And since we are at the chairman's university here at National Defense University, he's always asked what keeps him up at night. He usually says a lot of things, but he's actually drilled it down to this idea of this 2-2-2-1 concept, and you've probably heard him speak to this. He talks about two near peers, of China and Russia, and more importantly, their adventurism and their expansionist aspirations. 2 middleweights, North Korea and Iran. And then 2 networks, which we, I think, spent ample time throughout the day talking about: Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and then more importantly, transnational organized crime, or these illicit networks. And he talks about one domain in terms of cyber. So what we tried to do, and more importantly, to echo Josh's point about how we need to actually think about visualizing threats, this is actually extracted from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime that actually physically shows you how globalization has empowered illicit networks. The green line is actually cocaine, which through the case study by Matt Levitt as well as my colleague David Asher, and I've actually had the privilege of writing about it, Hezbollah does have global facilitators and global networks. And more importantly, you're seeing the price of cocaine in a disco in Moscow, Russia, at 6 times the price of that in Miami. So this is actually what you're seeing. We talked earlier about demand and supply and demand. The demand for these kind of trendy drugs, as societies become richer, you're actually seeing demand actually globalize. And these groups are extremely good business entrepreneurs. They are seeking new markets, and they're also seeking the best way in undergoverned spaces or undergoverned routes in order to circumvent sovereignty and control in order to achieve that. What hasn't really been mentioned is that actually human trafficking is the second most lucrative crime in the world. Sadly, that actually is based on demand for forced labor. And it's an area that we're paying more attention to, but the same exact routes that actually funnel drugs and arms are actually funneling people as well. And also wildlife, which someone had mentioned earlier. So in this world that we're living in, if we think about the basic missions of governments, it's to provide security that all of us are directly involved with, promote prosperity, to which President Obama in almost every one of his speeches talks about the resilience and the importance of economic growth at home and abroad. And thirdly, the semblance of society, rule of law or order, this sense of actually belonging to a community and being a responsible member of that community. And lastly, governance, that the government actually represents and reflects the will of the people. Many of the areas of conflict, those governments that are considered sovereign are actually having a challenge in providing those 4 basic missions. And unfortunately, this convergence of terrorists, criminals, and facilitators are the ones who are undermining and threatening that sovereignty. And I think all the panels have actually alluded to very specific cases where that's actually illustrated. We also have seen, I think the wonderful work that they've done at the CTC at West Point actually showed you graphically with Scott's presentation of how these different networks are actually intertwined. And the way that we actually think about teaching and examining our adversaries, and it's really based on our experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. How do you identify the adversary? In this case, we've just generalized illicit networks where you actually subsume terrorists, insurgents, criminals, proliferators, and their facilitators. We try to figure out what actually gives them strength, what actually allows them to gain control and power. A lot of our strategies on the military side, kinetic operations, have really focused on kill and capture in terms of the leadership. Other agencies have looked at the environment, the corruption that allows these groups to actually fester and more importantly, be able to foster different communities. The illicit activities that give them the financial wherewithal in order to enrich themselves and realize their actual nefarious agendas. Then technology, logistics, communications is quite critical. And then how do they arm themselves? How do they recruit and basically create staff for their actual organizations? And the area that many of you know that I've focused on for the last 12 years is actually the financing. Every single one of those enablers requires money. And several of us right now are working on looking at ISIS and ISIL, and more importantly, how we can actually stop the flow of funding that allows them to continue their really heinous acts that we've seen displayed on all of our different modes of media. What's happening is that all of these little illicit activities, they used to be local issues, right? Where there was always a local mafia. But we've seen with globalization over the past 30 years, as Michael has alluded to, is the magnitude and velocity at which these illicit activities have gone global, have created tremendous challenges for nation states that can only govern within its borders. These groups don't respect borders, and they don't respect the rule of law. And that's why we're seeing so many countries struggle. and more importantly, so many at the municipal, state, as well as national level with dealing with the actual kind of side, I guess more importantly, the consequences of illicit activities that perhaps they did not anticipate. These are just a couple of examples. If we did a tour d'horizon, as we say in the State Department, taking a look at the world, Afghanistan is actually producing more heroin and opium now, after 13 years that we have been engaged there with tremendous counterterrorism and counter-narcotics operations than before. It is a drug society and a drug economy. ISIL and Syria and Iraq, it's a question of how do we define what our strategy is? Perhaps it's flawed because we look at those two countries as two different sets, and we're trying to design two different strategies, while ISIL actually, we're mistaken. They call themselves the Islamic State. They're not even limiting themselves anymore to just Syria and Iraq. So they don't create borders, they don't see borders, but we're actually defining borders as how do we design the strategy to confront them. AQAP, people had forgotten about them in terms of a group because ISIS had been so much more in the news. Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, the FARC, and Shining Path in Latin America. They were the original examples of terrorism and crime in that nexus, perhaps about 10 years ago, fueled by the cocaine trade, and Hezbollah and its global facilitators. So what are we doing? So this has been the question, I think, that's been really on a lot of our minds in the kind of looking at all the doom and gloom of what these illicit networks are achieving. There are, in fact, several initiatives afoot at the international, the regional, and more importantly at the national level. So let's take a look at a couple of them. So if we take the issue of terrorism and crime, the United Nations, as well as the United Nations in New York with the Counterterrorism Committee, and in Vienna, the Office of Drugs and Crime, that actually provides tremendous data for us to actually analyze the problem, have many programs that are being applied to different parts of the world, and more importantly, trying to document the phenomenon, but also do a lot of training on the ground in terms of technical assistance. At the regional level, we have within the Western Hemisphere, the OAS, and then we have actually NATO and the OSCE extremely active now with the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. People had also kind of forgotten about NATO for a while. And then in the Asia Pacific, you have APEC or ASEAN. And then the African Union is very quite involved now with trying to help quell the problems caused by groups like Boko Haram. And then Interpol in terms of that law enforcement piece. So what are we doing here in the United States? So on Friday, Ambassador Rice released the new national security strategy for the United States. The one prior to it had been 5 years ago, in May of 2010. The world has definitely changed over the past 5 years. And more importantly, I showed you the kind of the map in my very first slide. Every single one of those issues is actually addressed in the national security strategy. But if you think of it, how can you multitask and address so many complex issues with the 1947 National Security Act that actually limits the size and the scope of the National Security Council? So we're basically dealing with 21st century threats based on a post-World War II national security design. Underneath the national security strategy, there are discrete, what we call transnational threat strategies. And most of them have been a result of a reaction to a threat that has been defined. So the one that the first one that you can see here is actually the one for counterterrorism, which was designed after the tragic attacks of September 11th. Counterproliferation has been with us for several decades because of the fear of the use of a weapon of mass destruction on our population or on our homeland. One of the oldest ones here that I depict is the counter-narcotics one that dates from the time of President Nixon. And I had to remind some of my students at Georgetown and George Washington University who Nixon was. And then the newest ones under the Obama administration in 2011 were cybersecurity and transnational organized crime. And many of us here in the room were involved intimately in designing the combating crime, because the question was, does it really pose a national security threat? And also that question, is it an existential threat to the United States? A lot of the knowledge and more importantly the belief that terrorist groups that do represent an existential threat to the U.S. could use or abuse or collaborate with criminal networks was one of the impetus in actually to create this national security strategy to combat transnational organized crime. When we design these strategies, we have to actually first define what the threat is. The second thing, we actually have to design an actual strategy. And the third thing, which I think has been kind of an undercurrent throughout all of today, what is the desirable end state? Because when we look at things like ISIS, when we look at things of what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, we're not really defining what the optimal end state is that can be achieved with the resources that we have. So what we take a look at is, are the institutions actually in place to actually execute and administer a strategy? And that has a lot to do, many of us actually here work with the Department of Defense. This is all about those authorities, right? What is the role of the Department of Defense in support of law enforcement in counter-drug operations? That's this basis of having the institutions. Within the institution, you have to have mechanisms or teams. These would be, in the counterterrorism realm, joint terrorism task forces, for example. Or in the case of the counter-drug war, basically looking at things like the Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West. Given a very discrete mission, and then most importantly, given the resources, right? And I'm not just talking about human resources as well as financial resources, but the technology. And hopefully today we've actually seen how many situations our adversaries are actually better funded, better equipped, and even more technologically adept than we are in terms of using Twitter. We were struggling today with the Beyond Convergence. I got a little feedback that Beyond Convergence as a hashtag was too long. So that's the feedback from the public. And then most importantly, we talked about it, and I think Ambassador Barton alluded to it, performance metrics. It's not how many people have we trained, how many times in a different country. I would like to know what impact those people have had. And that's actually the problem that we have with Congress. We have to always justify what we're doing with our resources. We're not telling a story. So if we think about a town or a village where we've actually been able to help in Central America, I'm not going to name the country, where the citizens themselves have stood up and they've elected a mayor who's actually rejecting the corruption and the corrosive effects of the gangs through assistance from USAID, actually creating an opportunity for them to take back their community, that needs to be actually told. And that's where we're seeing kind of a gap in how we're looking and defining metrics. And it shouldn't be kind of every quarter or every year, because I think you're not showing the progress that people are actually wanting to hear about. And we're seeing also that now in this globalized world with the complexity of threats, that the traditional instruments of national power are not sufficient. And it comes back to we're creating all these different silos. So we actually have been speaking and teaching about this model of the different instruments of national power. Several of our Middle Eastern and more importantly South Asian students have remarked, wow, you have agencies for every one of those instruments of national power. State Department for diplomacy, DOD for military. One of our Pakistani students observed, well, you have 16 intelligence agencies. I don't think that's very intelligent, which was kind of interesting from a Pakistani. I don't think he was ISI, but we'll have to check on that. And then financial and economic in the realm of Treasury and the Commerce Department and the other agencies. They all ask, but why don't you have an information agency? And this goes back to the history of what was USIA and how it was disbanded. And maybe this is why we're losing the war on ideas, right? An interesting perspective from foreigners that we teach and how they critique, or more importantly, observe the way we're actually conducting this. So I posit, since government can no longer actually provide with the instruments that are actually available, quick and more importantly, insightful ways to counter these different threats, we have to actually call upon different sectors of our society. And we hear interagency was kind of the buzzword the last 5 years. Public-private partnership is kind of the new one. And that's where we're going to take a look at a couple of cases. So I've actually tried to see is, I've actually picked 4 discrete areas. And then more importantly, because there are some very timely events that are going to take place in the next couple of weeks on these issues, how is the U.S. government, and in particular the White House, trying to engage different aspects of the private sector and the civic sector? When I speak about the civic sector, it's academia, it's religious groups, it's NGOs, who perhaps might have a better lay of the land than we do because they are actually a trusted agent in different communities. So the first one that's on everyone's mind is countering violent extremism. We've been grappling with this issue since the days after September 11th, 2001. So next week, here in Washington, the White House is going to convene a summit on countering violent extremism. This has actually been in the works for a very long time. which has actually not been very well disclosed. It was not a knee-jerk reaction to the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. And you and I know that people have been really thinking through what this would mean. We are all waiting to see what's going to happen, right? You can have the photo op with religious leaders and a conference, but the question is, how are you engaging local communities? And I think you've seen in the last couple of days a call by the FBI Director for Counterterrorism asking each of us in our communities to become even more aware and more, if you see something, say something, and take a much more active footing to be observant of what's happening in our societies and in our communities. Because the threat of attack on the homeland is actually greater than it's been in quite a while. So this is one of the aspects of looking at how would you implement that counterterrorism strategy, but more importantly at a local level. So that'll actually be next week. So we hopefully will see some of the reporting coming out much more granular than just actually the speeches, and more importantly, what are the next steps that those who are participating in it are going to do to actively combat the proliferation of violent extremism, and more importantly, the recruiting of foreign fighters, which is a phenomenon we've never seen in the actual scale of any terrorist group before ISIS. The other piece that's been in the news, particularly post 9/11, has really been the role of the Department of Homeland Security. We see them in different ways, and not necessarily in a positive way, every time we go to the airport and engage with our colleagues from TSA or on the way back with Customs. But if we think about the role that they play, it's actually quite important. And an area that has not really been highlighted that's extremely dependent on the private sector is critical infrastructure protection. When we who have studied counterterrorism, what would be the most 9/11 would be very, very difficult to replicate in terms of scale and the visual and the disruption. So for those who remember, 9/11 actually cost only $500,000, $500,000, 19 lives lost on Al-Qaeda's side of the suicide bombers. But more importantly, it actually disrupted the U.S. economy and the global economy for 19 days. So the return on that investment was pretty tremendous. And more importantly, what are these terrorists looking at? High-value targets that would have major disruptive effects. And we have to also remember that 85% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is in the control of the private sector. So we have to create better ways and vehicles for people who are in the private sector running this critical infrastructure to find trusted kind of mechanisms and channels to get information of suspicious activity to the Department of Homeland Security. So we have a lot of colleagues who work either in the cyber or more importantly in what we call utilities, who always express a frustration that I don't even know who to call except for the local FBI office. We got to figure out how they want to be responsible citizens and take on the mantle of being contributors to national security, but they don't know how. So that's an area that I know that Homeland Security is working on. It's more of how do you engage the local communities to be much more active. And then cyber has been really on the top of mind for many, many people in the national security community, but not so much as the Sony breach, right? Which actually not just kind of disrupted people's Christmas vacations, they actually disrupted people's careers, we understand now at Sony, and did a tremendous promotional job for that movie, The Interview, which is quite silly if you actually watch it. What you're actually seeing is a challenge on how do we define cybersecurity, and then how do we preserve privacy. And this is another area where the private sector is playing a very important role, but also it has huge financial consequences. The internet is a wonderful thing, access to broadband is a wonderful thing, but it's also very politicized and a very commercial thing. The White House next week also is going to have a summit at Stanford University looking at cybersecurity and consumer protection. You've seen all of this news of all the data breaches that have taken place. There's probably not one person in this room that wasn't involved. You don't know it yet, but in terms of who has your data, whether you shopped at Target or Home Depot or a client of Anthem, everything you do and you touch is vulnerable to either being cyber hacked. So the question is, there's very little that we can do to protect ourselves, but you can raise your awareness in terms of trying to figure out if it's happened to you. And the president's actually spent quite a bit of time focusing on how to better improve that communication between the private sector and the different parts of government that are involved in cyber. Talk about an interagency nightmare, it's cyber. How many people actually sit in these communities, and then you try to extract an actual decision is in itself an interagency nightmare and challenge. And yet we all agree that it's a primary right for us to preserve our privacy. We also have to think about the security involved. Then lastly, we spoke a lot about what's happening in Central America. And I spent a lot of time since I was a young child actually visiting Latin America. And it breaks my heart to see a part of the world that actually has tremendous natural resources and talent really undergo the violence and, more importantly, the levels of insecurity and desperation that we've actually never seen. And this is an area where I've seen that there's been attempts by groups like USAID to actually, more importantly, deploy huge foreign assistance programs. But it doesn't look like we're actually making as much effect and, more importantly, impact as we'd like. What is a move that's afoot now is to actually engage local businesses, and actually a lot of them are large multinational corporations that are based here in the United States, who see Central America as a market, and more importantly, in order for them to maintain and take advantage of that market, they will actually need personnel. So what you're seeing is an actual fight for talent from the gangs and the drug traffickers who also need their henchmen for their supply chain. People like Walmart and Starbucks actually need people to supply and, more importantly, sustain their supply chain and actually be able to bring Guatemalan coffee to your local Starbucks here in the United States. This is just an example of a couple of the organizations that are involved, and they are looking and specifically examining how you can focus on improving the plight and more importantly, preventing the human and capital flight from Central America with what they call youth at risk programs. So a couple of examples are these multinational corporations are now doing apprenticeships and summer jobs programs, as if they would do it here in the United States, for the children of the employees of their company. And the idea is to actually give them an opportunity to actually invest in their community and give them educational opportunities and vocational training they may not actually have. Because at age 13, it happens in our inner cities here in the United States too. You can choose to be a member of the gang or choose to stay in school, and when you're a little bit older, you can choose to either join law enforcement or the military. But these are opportunities that they just actually don't have. We've actually seen Vice President Biden wrote an editorial on January 29th in the New York Times, actually highlighting the fact that the White House will be investing $1 billion in assistance to Central America, focused on security, good governance, and more importantly, economic opportunity, which shows you this bigger kind of whole of government piece. And just to kind of wrap up, if we acknowledge, and hopefully today we've been able to really kind of solidify this concept of convergence, that our adversaries work in collusion, cooperation, opportunistically, as actual networks. We need to start to organize ourselves as a network and really break down the silos and barriers of what we call silos of excellence between intelligence, military, and law enforcement. Then more important, to bring it to the next level of how our national security and foreign policy is designed, we have to think about those 3 Ds of diplomacy, development, and more importantly, defense. They are not budgeted or resourced properly, so I do take issue with some of my colleagues who talk about the 3 pillars or the 3 legs of the stool. The defense leg would be really tall so that you can actually sit on the stool. But we do now acknowledge, for the last 10 years that we've seen through our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the real importance of this interagency cooperation and collaboration. And more importantly, what I would like to highlight is actually the greater need that we have to address all of this convergence with what we call the whole of society approach. Since government is no longer has a monopoly on security and can no longer actually generate prosperity the way it had traditionally done, what we need to do is engage the civic sector as well as the private sector, who, particularly in the field of technology, have much quicker turnaround times and a much better way of thinking of things creatively and even disruptively, as my former professor at Harvard Business School, the Porter School, always talks about. Disruptive technologies, we need to be much more disruptive in the way we're defining and, more importantly, ensuring our national security. So my kind of ask, because they always talk about you have to have an ask, for all of you, is to think about in each of your roles, whether it's in your household or in your community or in your office, how can we better raise awareness of the fact that every American citizen, and actually global citizen, has to also take a responsibility to become much more aware of national security and ways that they can actually contribute to enhancing the security and, more importantly, peace and prosperity in all of our different societies. Thank you very much.
Right over here. Fourth row. Fifth.
Hi, Barbara Solera from Air University. My question is for Ambassador Barton. Now, you mentioned evaluation as being very important in state building. So how would you respond to the critique, especially coming from those who work in development and state building within sub-Saharan Africa, that the problem is, rather than not enough evaluation, is too much evaluation, that various donor agencies want various reports that are actually taking away resources from addressing the problem?
I would just say that most of the evaluations follow that stay in your lane mentality. So the evaluations tend to be of individual projects, oftentimes by people that are from the field itself. So it's kind of an insider game for insiders, and you hardly ever get a more holistic look, a more integrated look, which is, I think, a big part of if there is this convergence, then you have to take the step back and take the broader look. And I would just say that when I was at CSIS, we developed a model for actually trying to see whether progress was being made in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it went a little bit beyond some of the work that others had done, which was mainly looking at projects and whether they had succeeded. Because what happened when you went to Afghanistan and you talked to anybody that was working there, this was pretty much the conversation. How are you doing? What I'm doing is going quite well. How's Harry's project doing? Not so good. So what you had is 100 individual successes adding up to one gigantic shortfall. And so you needed to take a step back. And I believe that what you had to do is you had to use literally all the work that was already going on there. So in a place like Afghanistan, you had 16 or so focus groups, surveys that had been done, one-fifth of your information. You had all the official government reporting and NGO reporting, one-fifth of your information. You had thousands of news stories quoting people. It's great to be an elected official, but I might get assassinated next week. Okay, that tells you quite a lot about whether you're making progress on democracy at the same time you're not doing too well on security, right there in that one statement. So that would be another. Then we also trained 7 different teams to go all over Afghanistan, and they did over 1,000 interviews. And they were not interviews done in a sort of academic sense of an existing survey, but we had them done as iterative conversations, the way a journalist would do it. I just talked to Michael, and he told me this. What do you think? Well, the last guy talked had an interpretation on what Michael had said. So you're progressive learning. And then we did 250 leader interviews as well. So you put all those things together, now you have a sense, and we tried to devise a simple XY grid, where on the X grid it was, how is the state doing? And on the Y grid, how do you feel you're doing? And oftentimes, so if we were just to take the comment of that elected official, it would look as if democratic progress was being made because we had elected an official, but the fact that he might be assassinated next week would be a counterpoint, and so then you would have, okay, that's at the very least in the gray zone, if not the danger zone. It's not purely a success that you now have local councils all over the country. So it's not hard to do this stuff. We did it, AID paid us about $250,000 to do it. It took about 6 months. But when you're investing $100 billion, you think, maybe we'll do this a little bit more frequently. We'd like to know whether the stock market is going up or down. That would be a good thing. When we did that particular piece of work, and by the way, I'm very skeptical about the evaluation industry because it does exactly what you said. But I think this kind of information, when you see the women of Afghanistan describing that their own personal position is getting quite a lot better, but they didn't feel that the societal progress was being made at all. So, and now you have a baseline you can compare to the baseline. These are all the kinds of things you have to, because Afghanistan started much farther back than Iraq. as a society. So you don't want to start at the same place. You don't want to necessarily get to the same place. So you have to customize it. Not hard to do, okay? But you have to take it out of the business of, I'm going to have a friend evaluate it, because the worst thing that could happen is for somebody to say that what I'm doing isn't succeeding. I won't be able to get my money on the hill and the rest of it. One of the nicest compliments I ever got when I worked at AID was somebody coming back from looking at our work, an $800,000 reconciliation initiative in Bosnia. And Bob Gersoni said, that's the most honest reporting I've ever seen in the U.S. government. That was the good news. The bad news, nothing that you're doing is working. Okay, but that was a really good, that was a very severe evaluation that made us rethink the whole concept of whether Bosnia was ready for reconciliation, which was the dominant idea in the State Department and at AID during that period of time. And we had to come back and say, no, that's not a market that's ready for reconciliation. We can make progress, but it's not going to be on reconciliation. We can get people back to living their lives in a somewhat more ordered fashion. That would be a big ambition. Okay, so you can use it, but not the way we do it now. When I was at AID, the evaluation industry had come in and everybody had their hands tied and they were sinking because they didn't know how to, they didn't know how to swim at the same time with their hands tied. So you got to be very careful about how you do it, but it's got to also be timely. Show up, the concurrent audits, something that we used quite a lot during the Central American Wars, that you would literally have somebody come in and do an inspection for you in the middle of your work so you could adjust it right then. You wouldn't get an Inspector General report 3 months later saying that somebody in your staff was misusing a car. So be careful, beware of the industry, but open up the opportunity, and you better get real-time information about how you're doing, or you're pretty well sunk.
We have another question over here.
So, David Asher, for both of you, just related to this auditing, concurrent audit's a brilliant idea and should be used constantly throughout government. Very rarely is used. But the place where it's absolutely not used is in threat finance designations. Selena, and Pastor, this is, we designate all sorts of people. What's our verification and compliance? If we treat this like arms control, we're going to be constantly following up on those designations and looking. I showed you a network earlier for one of the biggest drug trafficking, money laundering networks in the world. We recently looked at all the companies that are affiliated with that network directly under OFAC rules, which should be designated, that were not designated by OFAC. It's like 26 companies. So, and it's not to fault them. They're very thinly staffed. They work their heads off. But again, a lot of the, even recent designees, we haven't followed up with a fuller, fledged out list. Like I showed in my presentation, they changed their names. They like we change clothes, So I'm just wondering if, what you think of launching a verification and compliance effort just related to our counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, and other sanctions.
So you and I actually share this, and more importantly, my idea and my views on how designation is actually used as a diplomatic and a political tool, as opposed to going the next length. And I think it actually applies in a broader sense, not just in terms of threat finance. We're actually not holding these strategies, policies, and programs actually accountable, which comes back to the measurement piece. And this idea of having someone come and do the evaluation, it's kind of known in the Beltway of how that's actually set up. And actually, the question is not, so what? I think the question of the average American taxpayer should be, so what have you done with my money? And then more importantly, what impact has that actually done? Because a lot of times you can actually show, like, how many people we've actually trained in Colombia, which we've done recently in terms of following the money trail and actually doing a very interesting project now. We're actually doing an accountability. We're actually trying to account about how much the FARC is worth in terms of their net worth. And then more importantly, that will be used eventually, we hope. It's not just an academic exercise. That number, and more importantly, those accounts, the actual livestock and actual farms that they occupy and have taken from the campesinos, it will be part of what could be a reparations package. So it's an interesting way of, we need to take it to the next level. And we always think of sanctions, and there's been a lot of, and I think you and I have been on the backgrounder circuit for every news organizations around town. What is the impact of the sanctions against Russia? in terms of changing behavior in Ukraine? Limited, right? Because more importantly, they're more for show as opposed to actually be used as a much more strategic tool in resulting in what the end state is to actually bring these organizations, or more importantly nation states, to their knees in order to change behavior. And there's a big debate about whether there should be new sanctions on Iran or not for lack of compliance or failure to comply. That, coupled with the oil price drop, you're actually seeing tremendous physical pain in terms of the economies of Russia and Iran. So how do we think about using these different instruments of national power that we have beyond being just a political, rhetorical tool, but actually in a much more decisive way to reach what I call that end state, which we seem to be having a hard time defining what those end states are in those different crises that are taking place around the world?
I would just add that, I mean, any healthy skepticism of what we know and what we claim to know and what we say we know is wise. And there are some incredible claims that are made regularly by people that we respect, and that sometimes are just not that well grounded. I would ask almost every briefing that I started with the intelligence community to the briefer, tell me on a 1 to 10 scale, how confident do you feel in the information you have? Now, almost anybody who went above 2 or 3 was putting their credibility at risk at the beginning of the conversation. But if they said 2 or 3, which was probably exactly where they were, I mean, so many of the reports are single source, one phone conversation or whatever it happens to be. It's just, you just don't want to put young people's lives at risk when that's what you know. And I have my own Powell doctrine, which is, if we don't know at least 100 people in a country, don't send a U.S. soldier there. And that would have kept us out of a whole heck of a lot of places in the last couple of decades. So let's just, I mean, inherent modesty about how tough this is and what we've got to get to know. And so verification would be part of that. Now, I would just tell you that we get into some automatic traps here too. So vetting and designating is one of those automatic traps. The first time I saw vetting was in Haiti, where we got a list of something like 180 human rights violators. Now, it just so happened there was a handwritten list, and it was Jean-Pierre Jean, Jean-Jean-Pierre, Pierre-Pierre Jean, Pierre Jean-Pierre. And it was not going to be hugely helpful, but that was being walked around like some sort of McCarthy-era list of who was the human rights violators in the country. You don't want to get on that, and we got into that even more now in a place like Syria, where if a legitimate figure in the opposition is in a life-threatening situation, and they have a cell phone, they have to call whoever they can, and guess what? It's not the UN, and it's not any of us. So they might well call somebody who shows up in al-Nusra, and suddenly they're showing up as an al-Nusra collaborator or something. Actually, that was the Red Cross that they thought they were calling. I mean, that was as close as it got for them. So those sorts of subtleties, we've got to evaluate them. Otherwise, we're just in this trap. I hear about 200 terrorists moving from Denmark to Syria, and I wonder, 190 of those guys are going to come back in boxes because they're not all special forces trained. But it's part of the promotion of now there's legitimacy to it as well. So how do you sort out what's really legitimate and not get chasing some really dangerous things that could get us off track? And I think we've obviously seen that, and I think, even Secretary Powell probably would say that he suffered for some of those behaviors himself. And that's pretty, if you can entrap a Secretary of State in a highly public setting, then you've really got a problem. And I think this president deserves a heck of a lot of credit for admirable restraint in a couple of these cases, because he asked the next question. Now, if I do that, what happens? So I stop the bombing, who wins on the ground again? I think those are good questions.
More good questions. Sir, right there.
Mark Orelic, retired State Department, INL. On the slide regarding enablers of transnational illicit networks, I noticed that one of the major enablers was not on there, which is corruption, which underlies most, if not all the other enablers. Could you explain why it was not on there, and also its role and how you think we are doing in combating it internationally?
So the politically correct word is actually environment, which is actually why the corruption is not on there. As many people know here, I actually teach to many foreign audiences in multiple languages. And the word corruption in a specific setting for a group of South Asians was taken personally. And that's actually why we talk about an enabling environment. So when we have it, the first piece is leadership, and then if we were going to look at it this way, it was actually environment. Embedded in that when we actually articulate that, depending on the setting, because it's so highly politically and more importantly culturally charged, we talk about an enabling environment where actually corruption is the biggest issue. And if we think about what the real enemy is, it's not these actors, it's actually the corruption that they use in order to undermine sovereignty. And that's kind of part of the things that we're trying to study. There are tremendous projects and programs that are aimed at anti-corruption, but without actually really understanding the cultural nuance and more importantly, the way things are done or conducted. So as many of you know, I was a banker at Goldman Sachs for several years, working on the international accounts. The fact that my Indian client was actually shaking his head did not mean that he was ready to sign on the bottom line and we were done. And I could report to Hank Paulson that we closed a deal, right? It was actually acknowledging that my mouth was moving, right? It's a very different piece. And I think that's also something that we need to understand in terms of nuance. As we try to develop all these grand strategies, what is not just the national context of what's happening in places like Central America, what is actually happening in these different municipalities? Who are the power brokers? And I think Doug Farah explained quite a bit about the different dynamics and things that we assume because we come from a Western or a US paradigm of how government should work is actually not how things are being governed in a certain position. So just to give you the context, so it's like politically correct, we use the word environment instead of corruption. I used to have corruption until I got some feedback on that one. So there you have it. It's good, but it is one of the critical enablers. We will, amongst ourselves, admit that.
I would say we're not doing very well with that particular challenge. That in particular, if you look at the way the UN works, it has to be invited into the country. So that doesn't help with addressing that kind of issue. If you look at the way our diplomatic system works, that you can be PNG'd, you can actually be kicked out of the country if you step too long. So our incentives are not really as well aligned as they could be. If you take something like Transparency International, relatively weak NGO that tries to make larger arguments, and I think makes them quite well. But I don't think we've shown that we have a very good handle on it. There have to be more high-profile cases. There have to be more ways of taking them on. We don't capture all the corruption in our country by a long shot, and we have now different forms of corruption, such as you can stop something cold for 10 years by just opposing it, as opposed to defeating it, or making it controversial. So there are lots of other things that are happening to keep us from being a progressive state or to have these places. But I think we've got to dedicate a lot more energy to it. I don't think we're on it. And I would go to what the earlier panel said, which is let's look at the money and the people side of things, and really concentrate our efforts to see if we can get on top of one element of this thing. And it gets back to one of those early points. Okay, what's most important? And if we focus our efforts, then we can be fairly measured, as opposed to saying, well, we were trying to do everything and therefore we failed because we didn't have enough people to do corruption, we didn't have enough people to do this, we didn't have enough people to do that, and we had to do these annual reports. And so suddenly, you're not being held to any account. So I think it is an addressable problem, because generally in most places, and this is something we really worked on at CSO, generally there are silenced majorities in every country. Overwhelmingly silenced majorities on an issue like corruption. I mean, who the heck really likes corruption? And by the way, who likes having a dictator put his foot in your face? I mean, these are not tough numbers to build, that you've got 95% of the people on your side. So how do you mobilize these publics? How do you get them? And there are a lot of ways of doing it. And one of the ways that you do is you have every single project that you're involved in heavily labeled, showing what your contribution is, and so people can see what you are doing with your money in their places. And by the way, that doesn't exist. Most AID mission directors get to a country, or an ambassador gets to a country, and they have a really hard time figuring out what their portfolio is. And getting a really good accounting of it. So, transparency does help. We did about 2,000 projects in Haiti at OTI in the 1990s, and we labeled every single one of them so anybody in town, as they walked by it, could see what we were doing. We are contributing $2,000 of cinder blocks to your new school. We didn't do the design. The Leaning Tower Pisa was your own idea. We didn't do the air conditioning. You put the windows on the wrong side. But hey, this is how you learn. It's all about personal responsibility ultimately, and societal responsibility. And that's why, unless you like babysitting, and I don't think, most of us gave it up when we were about 14. So we're not going to. We don't want to be the world's babysitters. So we're not set up.
Ladies and gentlemen, we could take more questions, but I want to just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that if you have questions that didn't get answered today, please just send them to prism@ndu.edu, and we will try to get them to the right panelist or the right panelists and actually get you a response to your question or your comment. There's no way to summarize what we've discussed today. The agenda goes through to 5 o'clock. It's now 4:59, and I'm just going to ask, will anyone object if we adjourn a minute early? I don't see anyone objecting. Let me just then close by saying that it's obvious that we have a challenge in understanding our operating environment. We understand it in ways that are in some ways archaic, inappropriate. We use inappropriate intellectual tools. It's a complex environment. The way that we organize our response is in some ways inappropriate to the environment. So we not only have a challenge outside, but we have a challenge inside. I would also point out, and this goes back to one of the first questions asked today, we have a challenge with the American people who don't really take these issues as seriously on a daily basis as they might. And the question was raised, how do we get the kind of information, the kind of intellectual capital that we're generating here outside the bubble? Washington has a very dense bubble, and we're all very educated in these matters, but we need everybody's help in penetrating this bubble and getting these messages and engaging with those who live outside the bubble, because we need their participation. Partnership is now a word that's much bandied around. Public-private partnerships, building partner capacity. There's a lot of, what we don't know about partnership is a lot. Even in public-private partnerships that Professor Rialuya was talking about, they are a great idea in principle, but actually try to execute one. It's not that easy. There are many disincentives, but we do have to reach out to all of those assets. And to conclude, I'm going to ask you to join me in participating in a public-private partnership. We have phase 5 of this networking event will take place in the South Atrium, just 50 yards away, and it's thanks to the generosity of Deloitte & Touche and our good friends there. As many of you know, that the government cannot use appropriated funds for refreshments, but we can still have this Phase 5 event thanks to Deloitte & Touche. Thank you all for staying with us all day, and let's just walk over and thank our panelists. Thank you. Selena? Brilliant. I have a... I got it. Yeah. No.